Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Vasto of White in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 66. The fear of death follows from the fear of life, as Nod uttered softly, the spikes of his mask unfastening one by one as needles of spiritual energy formed all around him. I am your fear, your deepest nightmares unleashed. You are fools to face this fear, and will fall like those before you. Shut up. If you didn't steal my captain's Bankai, you would have never defeated him. Renji roared through clenched teeth which only served to rouse as Nod's memory. Ah, you mean that captain I fought in the Siriti? As Nod recalled with derision. Confident one he was, but a coward he proved to be in the face of true fear. You take that back. My brother was no coward. Rukia screamed, eyes bloodshot, while a circular cylinder of ice threatened to encompass as Nod in full. It did so, but promptly shattered while as Nod was entirely unaffected. Renji's subsequent follow-up with Zabumaru in Bankai form, a towering snake head formed of jutted snake spines, also did little to affect as Nod, who batted it away. The difference between combatants was just this large, the gap unbridgeable in the immediate short term. Admittedly, this wasn't a fight, but an emotionally induced suicide. Neither Renji or Ruki had the training or experience to be fighting at this current level, and had only stayed behind for the Zero Squad out of impulse. It was admirable, but in the end foolish beyond all measure of doubt, and as Nod knew this better than either Renji or Rukia did. You are both outmatched, yet you fight even still, as Nod stated more in confusion than anything else. Do you not know of fear, or is that you've yet to truly experience it? As if we'd fear you. Renji remarked with a glower, Rukia's hands bleeding from how tightly she gripped her sword, wanting nothing more than to skewer as Nod threw. Then you both are ignorant, as Nod declared. All beings have things that cause them to feel comfort, and things that cause them to feel fear. When they enter a place that causes them comfort, if questioned as to why they feel comfortable there, they cannot form a clear answer, merely saying things such as, because I do, and what not. As Nod could see the unease creeping into Rukia and Renji features as the subtlety of his eerie tone grated within their ears. Let me tell you, but when they enter a place that causes them fear, even the dullest of fools can identify the causes of that fear. As Nod raised a hand, the properties of the fear manifesting as writhing shadows. Darkness, cold, height, confinement, pain, contamination. People can list any number of reasons to be afraid. This is because at the most fundamental level, comfort leads to life, whilst fear leads to death. While people cannot give a clear answer why they want to live, they can give any number of answers why they do not wish to die. What are you getting at? Renji thinned his lips, complexion pale when his Nod's dilated pupils regarded him solely. He shivered. It is in the nature of all life to avoid death, and therefore, to avoid fear. As Nod stated simply. All living beings go through life for the purpose of evading fear. It is to better escape fear that they train themselves. It is to better escape fear that they grow and evolve. Thus, it is impossible to be unaffected by fear as long as you are alive, and hence your actions confound me on a certain level. With a single inspection, as Nod could sense Rukia and Renji's growing apprehension and fear, but then why did that drive them to willingly jump towards it? Revenge was a likely conclusion, but shouldn't the fear of death trump all? No matter. Their presence wasn't of particular consequence. As Nod raised a palm and numerous black needles formed and hovered him. Grabbing one, the needle elongated to the length of a sword callously tossed in Renji and Rukia's direction. Casual as the attack seemed, it was too quick for either of the two to properly react. The fear permeating within them itself practically rooted them in place, immobilizing them. If not for sheer dumb luck, they may have just perished there and then. As fortune would have it, the ground beneath them suddenly blackened and rotted away, letting them fall through and the attack to sail overhead. Renji felt relief swell within him from such a close shave with death, but grew more fearful for Rukia than himself when he noticed the reason for the sudden decaying of the ground beneath them. Barragan Luzenbairn appeared, having been tailing the Zero Squad after noticing certain anomalies with them. It would seem that his suspicions weren't unfounded. The Aaron car saved them. Renji took in a breath, but knew better. Barragan didn't even give Renji or Rukia a passing glance. Instead, as shadows stretched beyond a miasmic haze, hollow sockets black as night leered equally upon all. A coincidence then? Renji gritted his teeth, the hands gripping his sword matting with sweat as a shudder traveled down his back. This was bad. Among all reports in the Siriti during the Battle of the Fake Karakura town, the reports regarding Baragan were of the highest danger level among ally and foe alike. When Baragan moved, he alone was enough. A hissing noise echoed as gaseous mist escaped Baragan's mouth, a sigh equating eternity found in the fleetingness of a moment. Even a touch would accelerate one to old age then to dust. Renji didn't know who he should be more wary of in this moment. Asnod, who'd killed his formidable captain, or Baragan, who'd never once considered Shinigami within his notice. Even now, Baragan was disregarding them, which in a way gave a measure of safety. Baragan would neither actively try to kill them, but he wouldn't actively provide aid either. Renji didn't know how to feel at this fact, but knew that he at least had to stay in front of Rukia, as both foes before them were too dangerous. Renji and Rukia tensed as Baragan's gaze surveyed over all before focusing on the direction where the Zero Squad's members had left through, lingering spiritual energy marking the path. Scheming things. Baragan muttered darkly while assessing the speed of the Zero Squad's breaching into the palace and comparing it to the Vasto of White's forces before grimacing. The Zero Squad was obviously holding out, proving Baragan right to have trailed them rather than help lead his fellow Hollows. No matter, Baragan simmered. This Emperor will entertain them first. Baragan said not another word and took off. However, Asnod barred the way. Not so fast. Asnod hissed behind his half-masked face, head tilted oddly while wide eyes dilated. It was almost deranged how easily Asnod's odd caricature and demeanor could unnerve anyone. The king's palace is not a place where others can just come and go. Renji sucked in a breath, inching towards Rukia, who had gone deathly silent at the pervading purple miasma Baragan abruptly exuded in full. To dare block the path of a god. Impudence, Baragan said before grudgingly scoffing. He paid Asnod no mind, carrying forward and letting the haze around him to dissuade any from approaching. None of this was worth his attention when he was keen enough to know that it would only be a distraction for where he truly needed to be. Asnod didn't take the small mercy for what it was, instead launching out several dark needles that pierced into the thick haze, formed with enough spiritual density to propel forward despite time eating away at them. Subsequently, Asnod's needles pricked Baragan's arms reinforced with his arrow, but although they nicked him, they just bounced off with no effect. Suddenly, Baragan, who hadn't been giving much attention to Asnod, paused and stared down at Asnod's arrogance. Where did such confidence stem from? Anger and indignation bubbled from the depths of Baragan's being, unbidden to Asnod's continued ignorance. Your resistance is strong, but your fear will whittle away at your mind in due time. Asnod craned his neck up without pause, eyes rolling erratically. All power and resistance mean nothing in the face of terror. Fear. Baragan trembled, the clacking of bones resounding. Would a god know of fear? The skeleton whispered, annoyed. It was one thing to obtain mercy, as Baragan had his priorities, but it didn't mean that he wouldn't pass judgment once provoked. The eyes of a god of death leered down upon the unsuspecting as hot anger shifted into a turbid iciness. He no longer moved, the intensity of his gaze magnifying several folds as whispers reverberated in the stillness of a purple haze. I am desolation. Whispers of the apocalypse. Soft exclamations escaped all as more and more mist formed a spiraling dark cloud, writhing and squirming into the visage of a despairing ghoul. I am ruin. The voices continued unabated, echoing with the dull clarity of an abyss. I am despair. A hand burst through the haze, grasping out towards Asnod's face, who hurriedly retreated back yet was too slow on the uptake. The degree of improvement Baragan had spent in the Danga wasn't to be underestimated. In an instant, he was before Asnod, the area around him passing at an unbearably agonizing crawl. Time dilation. I am the sovereign of time and aging, a voice solemnly declared. The Primera Espada. The Grand Emperor of Skulls. Asnod found that he could no longer move quick enough. Like the scythe of a reaper, bony fingers reached out to caress his form, hollow sockets bearing down on him with impunity. The scent of decay wafted, the air rippling at the tips of Baragan's fingers. Judgment would be passed here. The hand bearing death as its namesake reached forward, mere inches away from Asnod, and all Asnod could see was a dark specter. It was almost uncanny how he knew that he absolutely couldn't allow that touch to reach him. Even with the strength of Volstandig, that power of old age would continue unabated until there was nothing left. Previous reports regarding the strength of the Arankar were no doubt vastly underreported. What sort of hollow was this? Was it truly a god? Never before had Asnod felt this stifled. Know of death found in the truest fear and speak of its name no longer, Baragan intoned with finality before a flurry of petals flew in from the wind. Wait, a voice spoke in the deathly silence of Baragan's overbearing aura. On my behalf, will you leave this one to me? An armored figure materialized before all to see, standing with a red demon's mask over its face, its body covered in bound red lacquered iron plates. A kusazuri shielded the thighs while armor beneath elegant flowing purple robes covered the rest, accentuated by the regal top knot of the figure's dark hair. Baragan hummed in thought, regarding the armored man who stood before him keenly. The man was one of those spirits materialized through Shiro's will, an ally Baragan supposed before considering his reply. Was it worth it to expend any more strength on this insect? Baragan regarded Asnod coldly, before scoffing in derision and removing the effects of his time dilation. What a waste of time! Baragan grunted before hurling Asnod away with a burst of spiritual energy before stemming the flow of his respira. Asnod panted for breath, phantom chills racking up and down his body, but neither the armored man or Baragan were paying attention to him. Do as you see fit, Baragan addressed the figure before directly giving chase to the Zero Squad, no one daring to bar his path this time. Asnod rubbed at his throat, unnerved with how close his own demise had come, and equally confused at the man who had arguably saved him from a harrowing ordeal. Like most Quincy stationed in the Soul King's palace, none of them were briefed on the Zanpakuto spirits Shiro materialized. You dash. Just as Asnod tried to speak, he was cut off immediately as the armored man raised his sword and pointed it forward. The message was clear. The man hadn't aided Asnod as an act of mercy, but to accomplish the deed himself. Very well then. Asnod had all the confidence. The presence of this man didn't have the same suffocating effect as Baragan's powers had, but was instead refined and almost subdued. That pervading sense of danger from before could no longer be felt. Do I know you? Asnod spoke flippantly, head almost twisted sideways in a leer before his eyes blinked from the flow of the wind and the pink blossoms carried in the breeze. My name need not concern you. The armored man gradually retracted his sword from a pointed stance in order to direct the tip downward, a single hand held over the hilt before the sword was dropped. The stance was all too familiar, and for Renji, he heard Rukia stifling a gasp while Asnod's eyes glimmered in realization. This sword form, Asnod features widened in recognition. It's you, but you're not truly him either. Senbonzakura, Renji uttered the Zanpakuto spirit's name. Captain, he then murmured. Brother. Rukia clutched at her heart, pangs of grief racking across her body. The sword was dropped from Senbonzakura's grip, and the blade itself fragmented into thousands of razor petals flowing in the faint wind coiling around his form. Asnod wasn't impressed. Oh, I have that too. Grinning, Asnod produced a particular badge that when utilized produced an identical shower of razor petals. It was entirely mocking in tact and demeanor, but Senbonzakura remained unmoved despite the fraction of a second it took to reel in the spike of madness born from blinding range consuming him from within. Senbonzakura did not speak, nor rise up to the blatant provocation. Like Byakuya whom he shared his origin with, he was never a man of words. Noble in posture, graceful in etiquette, and flawlessly refined in battle, the fall of Kukaki was an untimely tragedy born from cowardice. Senbonzakura stared beyond Asnod and looked upon the distant horizon, imagining the same sky once looked upon in the memory of his wielder. His hands balled into fists, muscles tensing from an insufferable feeling of loss and self-blame before leveling his stare fully upon Asnod. This power, did you not fear it by daring to steal it? The cherry blossoms swirl upon the wind, steadily growing in intensity as the clinking of armor sounded out in the storm. Let me show you the depth of your folly. An armored arm gradually raised up, the scattering leaves of numerous blade edges acting in tandem to the will of a spirit who no longer had any reservations and would take full advantage of the opportunity granted by the Vasto of White. Slaughterscape, Senbonzakura pushed his right palm outward, grasping with his fingers and twisting. Senkai. Petals scatter in the wind upon this barren world, moving to the will of one and dispersing into a ring encompassing a three-dimensional field in which only he and his opponent existed. The spiritual pressure forced both Renji and Rukia back as they spectated, but Asnod took it in stride. "Oh, I remember this. That captain used the same move," Asnod mocked, mimicking Senbonzakura's gesture and producing a similar result. "Is that all?" "No. No, it wasn't." The fight began not with any sort of subtlety, but with the furor of crashing waves. Storms of minutely sized blades clashed in a tsunami of spiritual power, needles of black weaving within the gale of drifting cherry petals Senbonzakura was all too aware of. Although Senbonzakura was a Zanpakuto spirit from Hueco Mundo, the unique connection Shinigami shared with their Zanpakuto was still accessible to him. Meeting Asnod again was as good as a second encounter and not the first. The power of the fear would only truly spread upon contact with those needles, but so what? Without warning, Senbonzakura removed all obstruction of the hidden needles, allowing them to strike him and ripple with the malefic energy of the fear. "I finally seemed to have bypassed your defense, and now it begins." Asnod welled up with a sense of satisfaction. Fear can be overcome through experience. Those who know battle often come to believe this. Fear that comes from reason is kind. It can be conquered through force of will or through experience. It is possible to suppress such reasoned fear by severing it at its source. But true fear is without reason. It is not an emotion, but an instinct. True fear occurs without rationality, without bounds. It is like a swarm of insects crawling up the body. We cannot escape from our instincts. Senbonzakura uttered not a word, the tide of tiny pink blades seemingly unaffected while a hand began to systematically remove each needle leaking with dark energy. Looking from the needles in his palm, then back to Asnod, Senbonzakura tossed the needles into the wind. This sensation within him. This growing emotion, was this what his wielder had felt? Only by experiencing this sensation itself could Senbonzakura come to peace with a single thought. My wielder was better than this. Senbonzakura balled his hands tightly into fists, shudders traveling down his back mistakenly assumed by Asnod as a sign of effectiveness. This wasn't the case. It wasn't fear that overwhelmed my partner, but the unexpected loss of my support which left him vulnerable. It's my regret, my deepest regret. What's wrong, not speaking? Asnod derided with derision. Where is the arrogance you carried in challenging the symbol of fear itself? Senbonzakura's countenance swelled, feeling the spiritual energy welling up from within him before craning his gaze up to glare impassively at his foe like a superior being to an ant. I am not arrogant, it is you who is arrogant for believing that we were ever on the same level. Senbonzakura's arms fell to his side, his disposition assuming one of inevitability, the fear infecting him from Asnod's needles overcome not by sheer will but by discarding everything that made him who he was as an individual. It was like Asnod had said, true fear is without reason and is instead an instinct. At his base, Senbonzakura like many Zanpakuto spirits was neither hollow, human, or Shinigami, but a sword. A question is therefore beckoned, what is the instinct of a sword, its base purpose? In the face of overwhelming odds, a sword did not cower. In the face of the inevitable, a sword would remain held aloft. The natural intimidation of a predator and the primal terror sparked by it meant nothing. This power of fear would never work on him if the only response was to cut it down. All too quickly, the intensity of Senbonzakura's blade petals magnified several folds, devouring the flower petals as Nod released before resonance occurred. My power was never yours to begin with. Senbonzakura gestured with his hands, and commandeered the razor petals before him, directing their flow with the simple movement of his fingers, and causing his Nod's eyes to widen in alarm. Petals fall from up high, dancing in the ensuing flurry. As Nod dodged and weaved while thousands upon thousands of flowing cherry blossoms pursued him relentlessly. Cut, tear, shred, the thousand blossoms carry the vestiges of a vibrant storm. The ring formed by the blossoms became a dome, trapping Nod within. Like grains of shifting sand, they inevitably reached and coarsely grated against Nod's blood vein. Quincy, Volstandig. Nod's eyes rolled backwards revealing the emblem of the Wandenreich, a burst of spiritual energy forcing back the ocean of ebbing blades while tears of blood trickled down his face. Totter Foras. Nod declared, his quincy robes tearing to reveal stitches all the way down from his mouth to his chest as his long hair waved ominously with dark shadows. The needles were no longer required. Any who looked upon him would experience the power of the fear, yet Senbonzakura did so without hesitation. He remained unperturbed whilst coming to a decision. The power as Nod exuded was too great to contend against in his current state when even Renji and Rukia who were spectating were frozen stiff in terror. The final verse, Senbonzakura intoned, his body beginning to glow and emanate with the finality of an ephemeral moment. All at once, Senbonzakura entered his final state, web-like cracks forming over his skin and armor throughout his entire person. The pressure around him rose even to an extent above his Nod's own, taking the man utterly aback. Senkai, a world, a space encompassing the distance between you and I, Senbonzakura intoned brokenly, voice steely and resolved as the 1,000 cherry blossoms vanished altogether, becoming too small to even be seen. This world will be your grave where nothing will remain. Ah! As Nod glanced mutedly at his own body, blood, skin, and bone gradually being eaten away by what seemed like grains of unseen sand. He was appalled, stunned. The fear in which he prided himself on proved useless in this instance. Even the spiritual energy he sued to shield himself was being rapidly cut away. Such a thing was unimaginable. Why Yuri not alive? Only an object could not feel an ounce of terror at my image. I never said I was. Senbonzakura made a gesture, his fingers squeezing as if gripping a ball and crushing it in his grip. The sound of tearing flesh and bone resounded as Nod exploded into a mist of blood that didn't even get the chance to splatter before each individual drop was intercepted and cut away. Senbonzakura stood alone in the space, neither reacting nor responding despite Renji and Rukia working up the courage to approach. Senbonzakura, you're my brother's Zanpakuto, Rukia called out tentatively, hands trembling in agitation and seeking clarification. She stubbornly clung to the hope that since Senbonzakura was here, the body of her brother may be alive. Needless to say, but hope was a fickle thing. Rukia had already seen even her own Zanpakuto spirit manifest in this war, but it had nothing to do with her status of dead or alive. The same would apply to Senbonzakura and Byakuya, but even if this hope was minuscule, it was still something Rukia insistently couldn't let go of. Senbonzakura didn't respond with nothing except a side-eyed stare that seemed less like it was looking at Rukia, but at something else far off. By Rukia's side, Renji seemed to have understood something at Senbonzakura's continued silence. Carefully placing a hand on Rukia's shoulder, Renji shook his head solemnly. Rukia, it's enough. Let him go. Rukia glanced between Senbonzakura, then to Renji, then back to Senbonzakura before pursing her lips. Just like the disposition of her brother, Senbonzakura seemed to remain aloof even until the end. A sob escaped Rukia's mouth before she covered it with both hands and let the grief she was repressing drop her to her knees where Renji silently consoled her. Senbonzakura continued to say not a word. This was how it should be. Senbonzakura looked up upon the void in memory of the master whom shared half of his soul now avenged. All that was left were lingering regrets, and doubts that could no longer be answered. Was this all worth it? Was it not? It didn't change what had already transpired. He shut his eyes and faded away into motes of spiritual energy like the cherry blossoms falling in the spring. Such was the cost of a Zanpakuto entering its final state until next the Vasto of White may allow materialization, that is if Senbonzakura even had the will to return. Thus, kindly I scatter. Only a fleeting voice trailed in the breeze, heralding the end of one of 4 pivotal battles by ensuring Baragan's swift pursuit of the king's royal guard. Chapter 67. The winds roared, gales the likes of which could engulf the world twice over in their ferocity wreaking chaos. A muffled groan could be heard in the breeze, but in the end it mattered little as Shiro tightened his grip over Waiwaka's face and hurled him across the distance. Spittle flew, before the deafening crash of an explosion echoed out. A single crater had formed several feet deep, and stretching a vast distance with spiraling cracks and black fissures. Hovering in the air, Shiro held no notion that this was all it would take to defeat one such as Waiwaka. In the confines of his own world, Shiro should have had all the confidence to curb any foe, and yet the adversary before him could also be considered a god of his own world. A pillar of spiritual light burst through the cloud of debris, reaching out towards the heavens and erupting with a suffocating pressure. Fingers pierced through the surface of the center of the crater, searching for purchase, and once they did, they pulled. Shaking his head to free it of dust and grime which fell from tousled hair, Waiwak was grinning before he hoisted himself up onto his feet. How quaint! How marvelous! This world brims with untapped potential, Waiwak murmured, staring across the vastness of what was truly known as unlimited blade works. It seeks to supplant the laws of reality and replace it with its own. This power, this place, it is like none other. Flattery gets you nowhere, Shiro spoke while landing opposite to Waiwak. His sole goal was to keep Waiwak away, and he figured this place as good as any. Waiwak dusted himself off, shadowed eyes all staring upon Shiro's own with a satisfaction born from testing one's self against an equal. Oh, apologies then. It would seem I find myself a tad loose-lipped now that everything is falling into place. The promise of 1,000 years, all the blood spilled, all the sacrifices, all of it is coming to a head. Your efforts against me are little more than entertainment. You may control this world, but my strength as the Soul King presiding over all overcomes even that. I am the law. Then I am a lawbreaker. This won't end how you want it. Oh, Waiwak narrowed his eyes, channeling spiritual energy throughout his body and directing it to his hands. The traditional bow of a quincy formed, made of azure light. It spanned a height taller than Waiwak himself. And what makes you say that? Because I'm beginning to think that we may be more alike in some ways that I don't feel too comfortable with. In Shiro's own hands, a black bow taller than he was high had formed from spiritual energy, seemingly mirroring Waiwak's own. Truly, men who achieve greatness have to be similar in one way or two. Waiwak felt the corners of his lips tug upward while his actions mimicked Shiro's own. The two both notched arrows filled to the brim with power, their features hardening, muscles going taut. Their battle began not with a rain of steel and arrows, but with the explosion of space distorting. Leaping high into the air, Shiro shot a volley of twisted arrows to counter Waiwak's own, his mind directing a flurry of blades scattered across his inner world to pelt Waiwak in his blind spots. Maneuvering himself, Waiwak struck down every shot. The swords deployed in his blind spots were equally rebuffed by Waiwak's own spiritual constructs. Similar to tracing, the strength of a quincy was in his or her ability to leech off spiritual energy and mold it to their will. This enabled a wide degree of versatility offset only by the lack of uniqueness possessed by the constructs. TCH, Shiro clicked his tongue before opening his right palm where a sword immediately placed itself to fire. He didn't have to concern himself with ammunition. The moment he required more, a blade would dislodge itself from the earth and into his grip. He fired, and fired, and fired, the skies rocketing with innumerable explosions which produced shockwaves and stifling pressure. Digging his heel into a platform of air, he backspun and shifted from an arrow set to strike his face. In the same motion, he leveled his bow horizontally, notched 3 arrows and fired back point blank at Waiwak's stunned face. Waiwak's bow came up to meet his, the two bows clashing and diverting the trajectory of the arrows. Grimacing, the two disengaged, pulled back, and then slashed at each other with sword formed in their right hands which both shattered upon contact. The fragments burst past the sides of their faces, leaving cuts and abrasions. Not bad, Waiwak commented. No, I'm just getting started, Shiro said tonelessly, neutrality bleeding into his tone. A sword is unfeeling. A sword knows no mercy nor consequence. I am the bone of my sword. Shiro reached out, gripping onto Waiwak's arm with a vice-like grip, fingers digging into flesh. Waiwak reacted by trying to cut Shiro's arm off, but what resulted was nothing less than disbelief as the clang of steel resounded. Sparks flew, the tiny embers fleeting and lighting up the features of both men, one grimacing, the other lacking emotion. Steel is my body dash. Waiwak pressed harder, piercing through skin, only to frown when the heat of flames lapped over his face. Fire is my blood. Shiro's grip tightened, the skin of his pierced flesh revealing thousands upon thousands of razor-sharp blades knitting the tissue back together. The ominous sound of clinking metal had never felt so foreign, so unnerving from unflinching bronze eyes. Despite possessing the power of the Soul King, even Waiwak still bled. Changing the world at one's whims was entirely different to changing the structure of one's physical body. One would think it would be simple as spiritual beings were constructs of spiritual energy given form and life, but Waiwak was a Quincy, a mortal, not a spirit. His body wasn't so malleable, and he'd initially thought the same of Shinigami and Shiro in general. Otherwise, if Shinigami could freely alter their bodies, they could save themselves from mortal wounds. Even blood vein only worked to make the body more durable by flooding one's veins with spiritual energy. The distinct clanking of metal grating continued to echo in the air. This was different. "What are you?" Waiwak uttered. The flames flickering within bronze eyes stared up into Waiwaka's own, the fingers of Shiro's grip, near blade-like in sharpness and digging into Waiwaka's flesh. Gripping tighter, blood spurted as bone snapped, and flesh was wrought from the sinew. A sick squelching noise resounded, Waiwaka's grasped forearm going limp. Unperturbed, Waiwak continued to stare. "What are you?" he repeated again. What was he? Shiro began to consider it. He was dead, memories of his own demise in his human life coming to the forefront of his mind. Then, came the acknowledgement that he may not even be in his own world. However, there was a name for spirits that fought on even in death, immortalized upon a throne beyond the reaches of time and space, they who perform miracles powered through legend, revered by all. A good question. Shiro lifted his left arm up, dismissing his bow in favor of a sword calling out to him. It shone in his grip, the weapon representing his ideal, and the one who had first fought by his side. What am I? I'll tell you. I fight not for the sake of vanity. Shiro shoved Waiwak away, pulling at Waiwaka's debilitated arm and hurling him a good distance. I fight not for the sake of pride or rambunctious purpose. The sword was raised, shining with a glow akin to the stars stared upon from up high, basking all in the radiance of twilight. Nay, a guiding beacon. Behind him, thousands of swords rose up, each shattering through an influx of magic energy and igniting into phosphorus-like amalgamations of power, burning like the sun. Do you believe in heroes? Shiro queried. Nothing more than childish tales and drivel derived from the actions of past Shinigami and Quincy alike, Waiwak scoffed, raising his guard and allowing shadows to stretch and form an army. His debilitated arm was covered by darkness, then once more revealed to be in perfect condition. Your question answers nothing. That's where you're wrong. No, that's where I'm right. I can see, I can hear, I can feel where once I had nothing, and yours is an existence that I can infer is almost identical. Stripped of emotion, of purpose, of direction, you like myself started as nothing more than a husk knowing not the meaning of your own existence. Your rambling, your misdirection, means nothing to me other than a distraction from what you truly are. What I truly am. Neither truly hollow, Shinigami, or Quincy, an amalgamation. Waiwak frowned, unable to discern the enigma before him. Shiro just shook his head. If one were trying to define him through just this present world's standards alone, they'd get nowhere. To begin with, when he'd first been found by Coyote in soul form, he wasn't really an ordinary spirit, but something more. A heroic spirit. Legend breeds strength. Strength funnels reason into cause. Shiro charged forward, sword in hand. The countless broken phantasms at his back followed suit, showering down like comets to clash against the encroaching shadows. If a heroic spirit embodies their legend as the source of their power and feats of impossibility, then the question of who he was, what he stood for, was long since known. Who am I? What am I? Don't you already know? Shiro gritted his teeth, pushing through Waiwaka's aura to arrive before him and clash swords of spiritual energy. The sheer force was enough to blow away all the shadows at once to reveal the stunned man beneath. This power. I have created over 1,000 blades. Motes of golden light danced, one sword equaling the weight of thousands upon thousands combined. For this was what this world was and will ever be. The swords in this plane, the weapons of yonder lore, the spirits of those who shed their blood, sweat, and tears, he was their symbol, their embodiment. No. Not only that. There existed one more aspect of what now defined him as a whole, tying into the name and legend carved out in this new world. I am the Vasto of White. Lord of Hueco Mundo, Sovereign of Hollows. The hole pierced through his chest began to fill until it was complete. That missing part of him, that which propagated the emptiness, all along it had been proof of what he had been lacking. It was through acknowledgement that he shed his doubt. It no longer mattered to seek a purpose, or to divine his own. The path was clear. Light of selection, glories of the past, the armory stands strong. Unite and gather. // The scene breaks away if only for a moment, revealing the flickering glow of all the weapons within the entire expanse. Spiritual energy pooled, gathering and congregating into a free-flowing swirl. The spirits of the Zanpakutos acknowledged it all at once. Let it be so. They shut their eyes, and allowed themselves to be drawn over towards one place. This feeling. Yamamoto, Kisuke, and the other Shinigami looked to the distant sky, nay up high into the bronze horizon. The squall of a phoenix resounded, puny winged stretching forth and gliding into the dawn. So, he has even that, Kisuke pushed down the rim of his box hat and whispered lowly. The Sokyoku, Yamamoto murmured, before his attention was drawn to the smoldering flames of Ryujinjaka trailing behind. The sight of his own partner rooted him in place far more than his own exhausted state. Kisuke, Yuruki warned. Yeah. I know. It's going to be a dangerous game we're playing, but as an ally, he really is the only one we can count on. If there was someone that could help, anyone that could make a difference, grudgingly it would be the Vasto of White. Of this, Kisuke had no doubts. Just be glad he's against Waiwak, Shunsui whistled, having stayed behind to guard Yamamoto, Anohana, and the other injured. I really don't know how we'd face that. He even has the support of our own Zanpakuto. What a monster, Yuruki had no other words. This was an entity never before seen rivaling Waiwak at his strongest blow for blow. He is not a monster, a gentle and regal voice interjected. All glanced towards the figure of a woman garbed in royal blue with plate armor and golden motifs. Her honey-colored hair was almost wheat-like in the lighting, the warm teal of her eyes belying a nobility and status of a ruler. Everyone tensed, but the woman seemed to harbor them no ill will and chose instead to continue watching until such a time as she was called to. A Zanpakuto spirit. Kisuke was the first to perk up, running through all the information he had of types of Zanpakuto, yet unable to pinpoint this Zanpakuto spirit's specific type. Then what else would you view a hollow as him as? Yamamoto questioned gruffly. For a moment, a tender nostalgia assailed the spirit, before she regarded them all with full surety. A hero, was all she said. / Unite and gather. Shiro called upon it. In this world, every being without doubt possessed their own Zanpakuto. The same could be said for hollows as well as Shinigami. He who had entered this world as a hollow had never once tried to get in touch with his own out of a lack of necessity. The light of the Sokyoku gliding at his back and merging into the blade in his hands all but signified the beginning of the end. His inner world wasn't the domain of a single Zanpakuto, but many. In which case, what sort of Zanpakuto did he have, if not an assimilation of all that existed within him? Forge and temper, La Armeria, the armory. Spiritual energy encompassed him in full, the light of his magic circuits igniting and awashing him in an unrelenting aura. The world itself seemed to mold to his being, conforming into a blade with the aspect of half of his soul as a basis. The rapid accumulation of spiritual energy resulted in a pulsating ring of light that expanded outward before a shockwave ensued. Dirt and debris rained down, pelting over the ground and mottling it with holes, followed by clattering steel from shattered blades. Waiwak was forced to shield himself, the density of his shadows snuffed out. His arms raised up to cover his face, his eyes pursed as he peeked through the gaps between his arms. As the dust cleared, he stifled a gasp. This ends now, Waiwak, a metallic voice pierced through the calm. I will stop you here, and leave Aizen and the rest to retake the Soul King's palace. You think this is over, but it's only just begun. You place so much faith in your allies ignorant to settle even the treachery you've allowed to fester in your own ranks. An army without discipline, without unity, is no capable army. They will fail for certain. No answer. In fact, there was no way to properly express the sheer height of naivete Waiwak could describe such blind trust with. I believe in them. And that's what makes you and I different. Everything that I know, I've experienced through the eyes and actions of others. I know of human nature better than all, and mark my words. Waiwak narrowed his eyes, taking them away from Shiro's new form to stare in mocking anticipation at the Soul King's palace. You may be able to keep me here, but in the end, you'll see treachery for yourself. The very justice that demanded the erection of a propped puppet devoid of his will and power through the machination of 5 noble families who orchestrated it all for the greater good. Veins popped over Waiwaka's skin. He may be labeled and described as a villain, but from another standpoint, he was a liberator, a revolutionist trying to usher in a better age than this stale and decrepit one. See, hear and listen beyond your blind sense of justice. Am I truly your enemy? No answer. Or is it the snakes hiding behind their guise of righteousness and cooperation? Inside the bottommost level of the Star Palace, Baragan frowned while picking up his pace to catch up to the wayward Zero Squad. Aside from a few minor complications, nothing could truly impede him. It may have just been by design or through intention, but Waiwak hadn't lined the interior of the palace with dark shadows, choosing instead to leave it vacant. Sure, there were obstacles and barriers in the way, but most of those things proved of little use once they came in contact with Baragan's domain over aging. Then there were the patrolling members of the Quincy, no names Baragan speculated were only around to inform the stern Ritter of any breaches to the palace at large. Considering that the Zero Squad had opted to take a subtler path into the palace, the Quincy weren't yet into much of a frenzy. Besides, knowing Waiwak, it was likely that he would have left a safety measure in the throne room of the palace where the Soul King had been entrapped. Bangs and shockwaves reverberated throughout, dust falling from the ceiling, and onto Baragan's head where it faded out of existence. Where are you hiding? What are you keeping hidden from this king? Baragan had never trusted the Shinigami from the start, and although he couldn't get a grasp on Shiro's true thoughts on them, he quite agreed with Aizen's method of treating them as disposable energy sources. A sadistic gleam flickered across Baragan's hollow sockets when he recalled the events of the Danga and what he'd achieved within at the Shinigami's expense. However, this didn't last when he recalled that not all Shinigami were indisposed. The Zero Squad remained strong, and a thorn to Baragan's side. To trust in an enemy is a venture worthy of only fools, and look to where it led? Baragan balled his hands into fists, and directed more energy to his feet, performing a flurry of rapid movement known as Sonido. While the members of the Zero Squad could easily bypass most obstacles in the palace out of familiarity, unlike Baragan, they couldn't just seamlessly route through objects and barriers alike. This power over time and death was Baragan's domain as the King of Skulls, and with it, he was quickly gaining ground. There you all are. Baragan began to consider his options all at once, his decision heavily leaning towards ambush and attack. No Shinigami would be an ally of his, and Aizen and his group were the only real exception due to their familiarity with Shiro. As for the rest, Baragan liked to think that Shiro was only tolerating them. Now that it's gotten to this point, perhaps there was no longer need for tolerance? All at once, Baragan readied his axe, coating it in a layer of purple miasma in preparation to act. He just needed to get a bit closer. There were 5 of them, the one with the prayer beads around his neck leading the group forward. Baragan considered who he should aim for. The first strike would be the most unexpected, and also the one that could deal the most damage while the people were unaware. Yet, nothing ever seemed to go Baragan's way. Call it luck, or the Shinigami's fortune, but one of the Zero Squad members, the fat one, noticed his intentions and tensed, while holding up a massive steel spoon. "Hello, friend," the fat woman spoke cautiously. "Friend?" Ha 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 ha, Baragan couldn't hide his mirth, but belying his deep chortle was frustration. Slowly, Baragan put down his axe, grumbling inwardly to himself. He had all the confidence to take them all on, but he'd lost the element of surprise, and if he rattled them, he feared that they'd all flee like annoying rats rather than stay in place. "Did I say some sort of joke?" The fat one confided with her comrades, seeking reassurance while sweat dropping. In the end, her bones would rot just as well as the rest. "Peace," the man with the prayer beads tried to mediate. Honestly, Baragan had never bothered learning their names, he couldn't care less. The entire group of 5 stopped in order to face Baragan, who halted 20 feet away from them with a final use of Sonido. Tension plagued the air, and it came in no small way from the purple mist regularly breathed out from Baragan's breath enveloping the air between them. Structures began to rot and decay, and the eerie manner in which Baragan merely continued to stare would send shivers down one's spine. "You are." The fat one coughed into her hand and tried to be polite despite ribbing from her comrades. "Death," was the Baragan's curt answer, eyeing his axe, and then staring back at the royal guard. "Odd name for a hollow," the afroed one joked. One touch of Baragan's hand, and the man would go bald for certain. An amusing thought if anything. "Enough, Hakaifyun, Nime ya," the fat one with prayer beads interjected. "The enemy is the Quincy, there is no need to sour temporary relations with our allies. Funny, Baragan interjected in this moment. "What allies? I don't seem to recall this arrangement." "Refuge is more like, hehehe," the clacking of teeth echoed with the laughter. The fat man's expression blanked, traces of anger flittering across. "Ichibe, I think I speak for all of us when I say this hollow's bad news. He looks ready to kill us," the man with the pompadour drawled. "A feat not so easy," said the stick of a woman with a golden half-crest crown. "There's 5 of us, and 1 of him. Indeed, the palace may have changed somewhat, but its defenses remain. It will take some time before the Vasto of White's forces arrive in bulk. You see." The fat man, Ichibe pointed out to Baragan. "You don't want this conflict. It only wastes the time for both of us. Our priority should be reaching the Soul King's amphitheater. Defenses? Alone? You're right. Perhaps I should even the scales. Persistent bastard, there are better fights to pick." A tick mark formed over the pompadour man's forehead before he drew his blade. "Face it, you're outplayed. You doubt the power of a god king." Baragan stretched out a finger and tapped the side wall of the palace. In an instant, an entire chasm disappeared and became visible to all on the outside. This elicited a sharp intake of breath. It was one thing for Baragan to spread his power across the entire battlefield outside where Waiwaka's specters hovered in the air, but it was another to focus it on a specific point. Coyote, Haribel, and Nell were among the first to sense Baragan's energy, see the breach he'd created within the Soul King's palace, and so neato their way over. This left Waiwaka's shadows to be left to the Zanpakuto spirits Shiro summoned. Inside the palace, it was now 4 against 5. The expressions on Ichibe and the others' faces who worked extensively to build a lead against the others soured immediately, but they weren't at the point where inciting conflict was in their best interest. "I believe we've started off on the wrong foot," Ichibe balled his hands into fists and restrained his annoyance. Meanwhile, Nell and Haribel gave Baragan an inquisitive look while Coyote was far more straightforward. She leveled her revolvers on Ichibe's face. The two sides gathered, meeting upon a tense impasse until a new straggler jumped through the breach. A lithe figure landed on her feet, bending her knees to absorb impact. She stared blinking at the current standoff. Silent made her appearance. It could be reasoned that she had no place here given her current strength, but ever since her encounter with Quilge and Giselle, it was as if there was something drawing her to the palace. A purpose of sorts that she alone had to serve. Subsequently, 3 more tag-alongs barreled through Baragan's opening. Ichigo Kurosake, Karen Kurosake, and Ishine Shiba arrived, all having chased after Silent. Suddenly placed in a tense standoff, it was no surprise that everyone was staring at the new arrivals. Ichibe and the members of the Royal Guard were signaling with their faces for Ishine and the others to quickly reach their side. It wasn't safe, they indicated. Ishine was inclined to agree, already inching towards Ichibe and the others while trying to reach towards his family with his outstretched arms. Ichigo, however, wasn't having it, frozen in place while Karen stood uncertain, hesitant. Ichigo was in another dilemma. "Ichigo," Nell called out insistently, all but yelling at him to stand by her. "Ichigo," Karen pulled on Ichigo's sleeve, prompting his internal dilemma to rise further. "Ichigo, I don't know what Aizen has done or said to you, but you can't trust them. They're just using you." Ishine felt like pulling at his hair, missing the irony of the statement when something flickered in Ichibe's eyes. His family was turning into a mess, and the worst part was that Ishine didn't know what to do anymore. The constant back and forth had Ichigo frozen. All he wanted to do was protect those dear to him, and now he was finding those he cared for vying for opposite sides. I don't dash. One person made the decision for everyone, Silent shaking her head at Ishine, Karen, and Ichigo stepped over to the side of Nell and the others. Masaki, Ishine flinched at the glare she was sending him, as if questioning his belief in her judgments. Ichigo no longer hesitated, and for her part, Karen chose not to either, recalling how human Nell had acted. She wasn't the evil hollow Vasto Lord the Siriti had her and every hollow out to be. No, that stereotype fell onto Baragan, who was as distrustful and abhorrent of Shinigami as ever. Still, he recognized Silent as part of the Vasto of White's forces, so he maintained silence. Ishine was the only one left gawking until one more familiar hard glare from Silent had him whipped and marching to file by her side. Silence ensued. I believe this is all misunderstanding, Ichibe stressed once more. Our goal shouldn't be to quarrel with each other, but to dash. Bang. A sizzling hole appeared by Ichibe's feet, courtesy of Coyote, who'd fired at him directly. If not for Ichibe's own reflexes, that would have been his leg. I see. Then I suppose you're all fine with making the Vasto of White stall for longer than he needs to. This time Ichibe's words had an effect. The more time goes on, the stronger Wiwak grows from his leeching of the Soul King's power. Your Vasto of White is strong, but what is Hueco Mundo's power compared to both the human world and the Soul Society? Work with us, Hikaifuan pressed, seeing Ichibe's words getting through to some degree. And why should we? Haribel spat coldly. Because we know the fastest way. Now how about it? The seconds ticked on into minutes. Well played. Baragan sneered inwardly, seeing the stances of Haribel and the others gradually soften. Peace? Or draw this out and increase the burden on the Vasto of White? The answer was already obvious. For once, Baragan lamented the absence of that man with glib tongue. Where was Aizen when you needed him? The sound of glass shattering in the air echoed, seemingly outside of anyone's perception. The answer may be closer than it seemed. Chapter 68. The silence was deafening in its intensity, the only noise produced from the echoing of distant explosions and the careful footfalls of measured steps. Faces were kept forcibly neutral aside from Baragan, who could care less about civility. The quicker they reached their destination, the sooner he could put an end to the entire charade. The entire group was moving forward at an almost sedate pace. Ichibe had grudgingly warned and advised them to repress their spiritual energy until necessary. It was likely that the Quincy were expecting them to take the conventional means to the Soul King's palace, but this was precisely what Ichibe was playing into. The entrances and halls the Quincy would have guarded would become meaningless, as they wouldn't even prove an obstruction any longer. Granted, this was only possible if no one used their spiritual energy and alerted the Quincy of their presence. Baragan's presence only further exacerbated the method's effectiveness. You see, Baragan's ability was innate. There was no need to fluctuate his spiritual energy or make any real conscious effort. Everything he could touch would decay on his whims, and this included himself if he wasn't careful. A distance of more than 3 meters separated the reluctant allies into 3 groups, neither too far nor too close, with Baragan taking the lead. The members of the Zero Squad would point in specific directions, and Baragan would grunt before extending a finger and rotting his way through whatever obstacle lay before them in a controlled manner. Tiny sections or holes like a worm eating through an apple began to appear within the Soul King's palace, and the groups used these paths to travel unhindered. No one spoke as Baragan once more continued to lead the way under the Zero Squad's instruction, visibly annoyed at the amicable smile plastered over Ichibe's face as they progressed faster and faster. For Ichigo, who was tagging along in a group with Nell, Haribel, Coyote, his mom, his sister, and father, he felt an inexplicable urge to smoothen tensions. Now that Ichigo was close enough to reason with his mother, he found that he didn't have anything to say because he himself did not know what course of action to take. His features stiffened behind his hollow mask, the lingering chains wrapped around his arms and legs from his Bankai form clinking with each step. Damn it! What was he supposed to do? No, what did he want to do? Glancing from his mom, the Zero Squad, then towards Nell, who placed her faith in him again and again, he grew indecisive. Judging from the way Nell nodded at him discreetly, she most assuredly believed in him to help their side should conflicts escalate. Just recalling her face of betrayal towards him in the Battle of the Fake Karakura Town had him flinching. Of course, they were able to sort matters out, but that made it all the more difficult to not side with her this time. If he did side with her, then it meant fighting the Shinigami. Granted, he didn't have the best impression of them after they tried to execute Rukia, but Karen and his father were both Shinigami. Then there was his mother. Ichigo's lips thinned, his hands clenching and unclenching repetitively. He had no doubt that his mother would side with Nell and the others, and when he thought about it, he really couldn't blame her. If he'd met Nell in the hollows before Rukia, then he may very well have been the same. Nell was kind, protective of her own to a fault. She cared, and cherished her comrades. A valiant leader, a stalwart warrior, she had a personality and character better than even some Shinigami that he knew. Then there was Haribel. She had always been cold towards him, but was neither rude nor confrontational. In fact, she was patient and never forceful in her means. If she could sacrifice herself for a cause or person she believed in, then Ichigo had no doubts that she wouldn't hesitate. Her devotion and conviction to fight for Shiro's sake would have made anyone jealous. Then again, it spoke volumes of Shiro's character, which Ichigo had experienced firsthand in his stay in Hueco Mundo. Coyote, on the other hand, was a different story altogether. He knew that Lilynet was part of Coyote, which explained how she accepted Ichigo so readily, but Starkey and Coyote's own vigilance against Shinigami meant that she wouldn't hesitate to kill them with extreme prejudice. If Ichigo sided with the Zero Squad, Coyote would show no mercy, Lilynet's influence, or not. Everything Ichigo had both seen and experienced in Hueco Mundo came to mind, and Shiro, the person at the heart of it all, reminded Ichigo of himself. Shiro just wanted to protect and save those he cherished. This was all the reason one would need to fight. Shiro had the admiration of the Hollows, even the prideful and haughty ones such as Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung Sun. Even Ichigo thought the three were a handful, but they were respectful to Shiro and Haribel. In any case, the point of the matter was that his mother's faith in Shiro was the same as all the other Hollows who followed him. Ichigo too thought the same. Shiro's motives, his actions, none of them carried any vile intent. Ichigo had no doubts that Shiro was a good man despite being a Hollow. His mother understood this, and he understood this, but what about everyone else? The Shinigami who viewed all Hollows unfavorably, the humans who feared them, and the Quincy who'd kill them without remorse? The determined expression on Silent's features all but revealed her intentions. There was simply no way for Ichigo to see an out in this scenario, nor could he convince her to stay put and leave the situation to the rest like he wanted. He'd thought he'd lost her once, but this time he was strong enough to protect her, and he would be damned if he lost her again. Looking at his father and Karen, Ichigo found all of them in a similar dilemma, mouths opened, but words failing them. Awkward was honestly the only way to describe the atmosphere between the Kurosaka family, but tense would be the more apt term overall for the situation as a group. Both Coyote and Haribel were staring coldly at Karen and his hind as if they expected the two to stab them in the back, and would massacre them at the slightest sign of aggression. Baragan's additional looming threat of constant decay overbearingly surrounding their backs and pressuring them at all times wasn't helping in the slightest either, but if anything, Coyote, Haribel, and Nell's unconcerned attitudes gave Ichigo some confidence. Karen and his hind, not so much. Karen shivered, shifting to walk as far away from Baragan as possible, but flinching under Haribel's frigidly stern gaze on the side. There were no safe zones here other than those she felt she could rely on. She would never admit it, but she was glad that Goatface was next to her, and that Ichigo slowed down and blocked Haribel and Coyote's view of her. They won't do anything. I swear, Ichigo insisted stiffly, the gravely baritone of his hollow voice unnerving Karen more than she was willing to admit. Of course, Karen didn't miss Ichigo's nervous shudder wasn't missed when Haribel grunted and turned away. He was still trying to protect them even now, changed into some part hollow, he was still her big brother. I'll hold you to that, Coyote replied. There won't be any problems, Nell mediated. I trust Ichigo just like Haribel trusts her followers. Put some faith in him, and you'll be surprised how strong he actually is. He may be stronger than even Haribel and I. The pressure on Ichigo abruptly doubled at Nell's words, his features stiffening, but Haribel looked taken aback. You have such faith in him? Wasn't he just a new companion you found and took under your wing after the invasion of the Siriti? Karen's lips pursed at the reminder of her and the others' failure in the invasion of the Soul Society. Scowling, A tic formed over her forehead before she butted herself to the side of Ichigo and tried to interject. Kidnapped you Maya dash. Karen barely got the words out before she grunted, is Hein elbowing her on the side. Her eyes widened in alarm, before even Ichigo ended up nudging her. Ichigo? Dad dash. Not one more word. Focus and stay vigilant, is Hein whispered solemnly. Unseen to Karen, but Baragan retracted a tendril of miasma exuding from his form moments away from touching Karen's shin. Nell narrowed her eyes, her relationship with Baragan similar to a grudging camaraderie. Yet, past grudges and preconceptions still existed. Baragan. Your intervention is unnecessary. Intervention. Karen blinked before finally noticing the wisp of miasma dancing dangerously close to her. Gee, get it away. She lurched to the side, pressing herself closer to Ichigo and Hein, who regarded Baragan warily. Karen gulped. She knew what Baragan's ability could do. Even now, her eyes had been unable to peel themselves away from the sight of a nameless Quincy fading into dust as skin peeled, blackened, rotted, and then the bones ground down to ashes. Humph, Baragan clicked his tongue. Very well. Handle it yourselves then. I merely saw an opportunity to act had the Shinigami erred. Pity. Karen shivered from while looking at the soulless depths of Baragan's eyes. One wrong move, and he really would have killed her, and everyone knew it. Hein tensed, while Ichigo grabbed onto the hilt of his sword. The most unexpected development, however, was Silent standing in front of all of them. Nell sighed before looking to Haribel and Coyote. See. Shiro trusts Silent and she trusts these Shinigami. The both of you shouldn't be so tense anymore. Nell diffused the situation, and only then did they continue progressing as before. The Zero Squad had seen the interaction, but chose to remain quiet on the matter given that Karen and Hein were the ones who chose to travel near the hollows. As everything settled, only one thing changed. Standing in front of Karen, Silent fretted over her daughter, checking her for injuries and worrying over the paleness of her complexion before hugging her. Mom, Karen choked out. Silent merely shook her head at Karen in chastisement in an effort to warn her from taking any actions that could seem offensive. Coyote, Nell, and Haribel were one thing, but Silent knew Baragan would immediately kill any unexpected variables. She means well, Karen. This isn't the time to be making enemies, Ichigo reasoned. Nell and the others are good people, but even they are wary of Baragan. Masaki, Hein interjected at this point, staring at Silent with moist eyes. The sheer emotion in his features caused Silent's expression to soften. Hein could see the recognition in Silent's gaze, and the sanity in Ichigo's mental state despite hollowification. The elation of it all nearly had him picking Silent up in a warm bear hug, but all he earned was a rapt hit to the forehead and a pout. Silent shook her head at Hein. Now wasn't the time, she mimed. Hein glanced from Silent still comforting Karen then to himself, but said nothing despite looking defeated. He sobered quickly though as the Zero Squad quickened the pace of the group. Masaki, listen to me. You shouldn't be here. None of us should be, Hein stressed in barely a whisper, nearly pulling at his hair. You can't compare to the strength of the people here. They're all leagues above any normal hollow or Shinigami. You being here is practically just throwing yourself into a fire. Hein craned his neck sharply towards his eldest son. Ichigo. I need you to take your mother and sister out of here back from where we came from. All of this is too far over our heads, but the Zanpakuto spirits the Vasto of White summoned will surely protect you on the way back. If Injetsu is out there too, then he'll surely guarantee it. Old man. Ichigo discreetly stared at Nell, who was giving him the privacy to speak with his family and not eavesdropping on them. As for Baragan, Coyote, and Haribel, none of them were interested in the first place. Nell's consideration and character were making things even more difficult for Ichigo. He couldn't see himself abandoning her, just as he couldn't see himself abandoning any of his friends. I can't. If Nell and the others are jumping into danger, then I have to be there. They're Arrancar, hollows. That doesn't mean they're monsters. I know now that if that old man leading the Siridi were more open to peace talks, then Shiro wouldn't have resorted to violence. Shiro. The Vasto of White, Ichigo clarified. You should have an understanding about the type of person he is by now. Ishine winced, but he still shook his head. His duties and philosophies as a Shinigami were long since ingrained in him, and besides, one thing Urahara had told him was correct. Ichigo, do you hear yourself? Regardless of the Vasto of White's character, he's someone who's going to uproot the balance of the world, and that makes him no different from Waiwak. Slap. Ishine touched his cheek to see Silent glaring at him with a "you're sleeping on the couch" expression. She'd long since let Karen to walk on her own, and was now shaking her head in disappointment. Masaki. Silent scowled and gave Ishine the cold shoulder, prompting Ishine to look lost at Ichigo, who felt just as helpless. Karen hesitated as she saw everything transpire, but she rushed after Silent regardless, Ishine and Ichigo close behind. // The Soul King's palace was a large and intricate structure, only made more difficult to navigate through after Waiwaka's transformation of it. However, the central parts were still roughly identical from what Ichibe and the others remembered. By this point, the central palace's amphitheater where the Soul King's power resided embedded within a crystal was fast approaching. Absently, Baragan placed his hand against another wall that needed to be removed, and immediately, the pristine white faded into black. It was almost morbid how reinforced barriers and walls could melt away so easily. My goodness. I don't think I'm ever going to get used to this. Hikaifyun sucked in a cold breath when she considered the type of fortifications the palace had been reduced to nothing. Time and age. Hardly anything can last forever. What a terrifying power, Nimeo said solemnly. I've made a lot of Zanpakuto with various unique abilities and powers, but even then, not many could rival this sort of ability. Just be at ease that it's to our present benefit, Senjimera said softly. Her black hair elegantly brushed and kept up by a golden half-moon hairpin danced with each step. An air of nobility and grace exuded from her, but she gave nothing away as for what capabilities she possessed. Don't take it for granted, Tenjiro grimaced, spitting out the small stick he was chewing on and readying his blade. Something tells me that it won't last for long, and there's only one wall left until we reach the amphitheater of the palace's audience hall. Baragan perked up at the words while everyone else tensed. Ichibe was the only one who maintained an amicable smile. He could be quite shrewd if anything, but no one could really get an accurate read on him. Finally, let's get this farce over with. Baragan no longer cared about subtlety and flared his spiritual energy out in front of him to impact the final wall. Immediately, the nearby Quincy startled in alarm, but by then it was already too late. With the gurgling sound of sloshing fluid and grating sand, the final wall broke free to reveal a room in which lied a grand podium suspending a crystal-like outline enveloped by twisting shadows. Interlocking blue spiritual chains spread in 4 directions suspended the crystal in the air. There it was. Ichibe and the members of the Zero Squad glanced at each other and nodded, slowing down their pace as Baragan all but barged into the room where many Quincy lay stationed. There were several of them, but none were simple. They were Waiwaka's Sternritter, 26 members each designated with a letter from the alphabet. Several were missing from the original 26, but the few remaining were the strongest in the force. Some who'd even perished prior were present at the expense of the weaker members who were killed in a ritual known as Quincy Holy Selection, Auswallen. Leading them all was Waiwaka's protective echelon, the Scoots Staffel, Leelbaro, Pernida Parncages, Gerard Valkyrie, and Askinnak Elivar. Each was said to be strong enough to rival the Zero Squad's members, and all stood opposed before them. All were startled at the sudden entry of intruders as there were no reports of anyone breaching the inner palace through the only known entrance. Our lives for His Majesty. The Quincy only took an instant to mobilize, spreading out to form a perimeter around the podium as Nell and the rest arrived near Baragan. How feeble, Baragan muttered, uncaring for how the Quincy reacted, but clenching his jaw when he then glanced at Nell and the rest. His eyes narrowed, not seeing Ichibe and the others at all. Impossible, how did they elude my Pesquisa? Above us, Coyote snarled. All gazes shifted, including the Quincy's. Kneel, unworthy blasphemers of the sacred rite. Look not upon yourselves with honor nor redemption for this travesty. This rebellion. But with contempt of standing. The distance between us will never be crossed. The voices echoed and blended into a corporal form, black ink spilling out from Ichibe's fingertip and drawing a pentagram. Bakudo #39, he intoned, black ink shining a fiery blue. Kodi I no insho. Emperor's Seal. Ichibe, Tenjiro, Senjumeru, Hakaifyun, and Nimeo stood in a pentagram formation, their index and middle fingers pointed up in Buddhist prayer. Suddenly, the Quincy who stood around the Soul King's podium were forced back as a spiritual art augmented by all 5 members of the Zero Squad formed a barrier around it which they easily passed through. Almost simultaneously, a wave of purple miasma washed over it. Like waves ebbing upon the shore, the miasma convulsed and writhed encircling the entire barrier. Any and all who came into contact with the mist rotted away, including the very bindings suspending the podium at the center of the room. However, this feeling. Baragon scowled in realization. I am the seer of true names, and your power cannot break that which is eternal, Ichibe replied calmly from the other end of the barrier. The Emperor's Seal can only be activated with the bodies of the Royal Guard acting as conduits. It's the final defense of the Soul King and repels all those not of royal blood. It's useless against Waiwak, but against all of you, this distance can't be crossed. Fool. The Majesty's power runs through all Quincy. Senjumeru, Ichibe replied evenly. Understood. Senjumeru revealed a veiled smile, the clothes on her person stretching and enveloping the barrier before separating from her. My cloth is imbued with the oaken itself. Its defense is stronger than the 72 barriers of the palace combined. Those bastards, Nell grimaced, watching the situation devolve rapidly. No one had any clue what the Zero Squad had in mind, yet Nell, Haribel, and the rest inherently felt a sense of foreboding. Coyote, can you destroy that barrier? Haribel asked. It shouldn't be that easy. If it's really tied to the Soul King's energy, then unless you can punch a hole through a dimension it's not possible to break, Ishine put in his analysis under Silent's hurried urging. However, if the barrier is only sustaining itself through the Soul King's energy, then it means that it may have a limit to what it can absorb and store. You'd need an attack so strong that it shatters the entire barrier without giving it any time to recover. Humph. Stand aside. Coyote stepped forward while taking in a deep breath. There weren't many things she cherished, but the fear of loneliness she held within her was reason enough. If she failed, then she'd lose it all. Cry out and howl at the moon. She couldn't let that happen. For the first time, she drew in at the entire wellspring that was her spiritual reserve. Los Lobos. Her nails pierced into the flesh of her palms, blood splattering over her drawn guns and shifting their color a violent crimson in preparation. An explosion of spiritual pressure erupted with her at its base. It was overwhelming, the entire palace shaking to the point that all present even had the impression that it was comparable to Shiro and Waiwaka's attacks. Ichibe, who'd focused his sole attention on Baragon, suddenly twisted his gaze sharply to Coyote. The Quincy did their best to endure the pressure, but merely watched on. For Ichigo, Ishine, and Karen, this was the first time they'd ever felt this sort of pressure. Karen let out a feeble whine of exertion. Coyote focused. Failure was not an option. She couldn't lose him again. Never again. Stark. The revolver hummed, drawing in power to the muzzle. Lilynet. Pink flames alighted over the socket of her skullcap, covering her right eye. The world was shaking. It was an attack that could level the entirety of Los Nakas in Hueco Mundo in a single blow and more, and yet this time, it was performed in the hands of the strongest Vasto Lord of the past. As the sole Vasto Lord of her era, she who stood on the top possessed a spiritual reserve unimaginable, forcing her being to divide if only to stave off loneliness. It happened simultaneously. An arm pointed forward, blinding light flashing throughout the dimension in response. Like the ebbing of a tide of ocean water, the chaotic waves drew back, and then returned forth with the furor of an even greater wave. Pulsating bands of light converged over the revolver's tip, a tumultuous storm of energy violently condensing into volatile levels until reaching an unfathomable head. The sheer spiritual pressure exuding from her now crushed the ground of the palace, and produced violent buffeting winds sharp enough to cut, forcing even her own allies to shield their faces. The Grand King's Zero. Gran Rey Zero. She intoned, keeping the amalgamation of her strongest attack at the tip of her revolver's muzzle while staring right into Ichibe's eyes. Coyote could see from the apathy of Ichibe's expression that he was confident. It made her uneasy, hesitant, doubtful. Even this wasn't sufficient. The revolver in her hand thrummed, starkly conveying a single thought in their shared mindscape. Immediately Coyote made up her mind. That's right. Right now, she wasn't alone. She aimed. Zero. That's not going to be an Ugdash. Coyote abruptly pointed the direction of her revolver towards Nell, much to the stupor of those watching, but the understanding of Nell. The attack was overwhelming and fast. There was hardly any time to react at all, but Nell wasn't a pushover. She didn't know if she could endure this much power, but she knew that her base form was far from enough. She needed greater power, greater control. Immediately, she drew her sword. Declare, Gamuza. Green spiritual energy enveloped her before her resurrection form manifested. The Capricorn Knight. She stood with the upper body of a woman and the lower half of horse. A mythical centaur. Flourishing the tip of her spear ahead of her, she placed both hands on her lance's hilt. She thought of her motivations, her goals, her desires, and what most reflected her as a person. Resurrection was the return of an Arankar to their holoistic nature. Gamuza was her form as a Vasto Lord, but there was something even further beyond. Gallop and thrust. Her accomplishments would not have been for nothing. Segunda etapa, Guerrera de Lanza Verde. Warrior of Green Lance. A second welling of spiritual energy erupted from her, covering her form entirely in thick smoke blown away by the wind and Coyote's incoming attack. All traces of Nell's hollow mask had vanished, replaced by 4 curling black and white horns. The fur on her equine lower half was now darker in areas and extends to cover her upper body, arms, and hands, while glowing pink markings extend from her torso to her chest and shoulders. Pink spiritual energy wafted off in flames from her tail and hooves. Almost instantly, Coyote's attack reached the tip of her lance where it inexplicably froze in place. Opening her mouth, Nell began funneling in the potent spiritual energy down her throat without restraint. This was her speciality, one of her strongest innate abilities as a Vasto Lord. A pregnant silence ensued as the sheer scale of Coyote's Zero disappeared into Nell's stomach before a terrifying pressure a magnitude above Coyote's own attack swelled into existence. Space distorted and cracked, creating suction forces that pulled in the spirit particles of even the palace itself. Integrate, then assimilate. Any traces of calm fled Ichibe's features as he sensed the potency of this new attack. No, don't. Stop. Unminding, Nell opened her mouth to reveal a pink sphere of spiritual energy, creating a suction vortex at its origin. The power contained within it was enough to affect gravity and the laws of the world itself. Zero double. Nell could assimilate the power of another hollow Zero and double its power by fusing her own Zero on top. Without hesitation, the attack mercilessly launched forward, the Quincy fully intent on letting it hit, some even moving aside and bowing mockingly at Ichibe. You fool! Ichibe's features twisted moments before the Zero struck the barrier and shattered it into glass-like fragments that faded away into brittle shards. Holes mottled the ground as a shower of energy washed over all, leaving cracks and fissures into the once pristine tiles. Now everyone has an equal chance, Nell replied unperturbed, panting for breath, blood trickling down from ruptured veins. Coyote's power really was just too much. She collapsed onto her knees until Ichigo moved to support her. Heh ha 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 ha. A cackling echoed at Ichibe and the royal guard's expense. How fitting. How grand. This king is amused. The fate of the realms hangs in the balance and you're amused. And that's where you're wrong, Baragan chuckled. The fate of your realm, your balance hangs in the thread. Whatever you or the bugs seek to do, none of it matters. Our goal is merely to destroy what's before us. Baragan stared at Nell with something akin to almost respect for what she enabled, something he only showed to Coyote and Shiro. Nell's capability of enduring Coyote's attack was worthy of regard. Now, the God King would take the stage as everything devolves into madness. A massive and violent free-for-all fitting for any hollows. Survival of the fittest. The strong will reign over the weak. Baragan harnessed his spiritual energy and let it erupt around him. With the Soul King's power eliminated, nothing stood to contest the Vasto of White. An era of hollows was guaranteed to be ushered. The stage was set. Chapter 69. The only way Ichigo could accurately describe the sudden frenzy before him was chaotic. Bodies were flying, many vaporized under unrelenting bursts of spiritual energy, while others were cut and gouged. Rivers of blood seemed to flow and ebb, splatters creating showers that mottled the white walls in a viscous red. Many Quincy of the stern Ritter that the Shinigami and Hollows thought were dead weren't quite so. The Quincy's holy selection, Auswallen, allowed their rebirth at the cost of numerous lesser Quincy deemed unfit to continue carrying their power. Leelbaro was one such stern Ritter and leader of Waiwaka's Scout's Staffel, or upper echelon, that was reborn. A black rifle was in his hands, and each fired shot pierced holes through the cloths Senjamera weaved as shields to keep everyone at bay. At this point, with the Zero Squad nearest to the Soul King's embryo, they were the target of numerous attacks including Coyote's rapid-fire Zeros. The sheer magnitude of just how much punishment Senjamera's weaved clothes managed to redirect the attacks rather than taking them head-on spoke volumes of her skill. Even then, sweat glistened over her refined brows, her complexion paler than usual. Spiritual pressure blanketed the area, the air a suffocating hellscape. Ichigo could feel his feet digging into the ground, as all fighting commenced in full. Everything was a blur from this point, but beyond it all, was a growing sense of not belonging. What was he doing here? What purpose was he trying to serve? Near him, he could see Karen's knees buckle at his side, sword propped over the ground to support her weight. His mother was no different, hands planted over her knees in strain and a frown marring her face. Explosions echoed out, rocking the very foundations they all stood on. Despite it all, it was the tiny nuances that he could see on their faces that spoke of a firm determination. A goal, if you will, that he was certainly not without, but had already lost faith in executing. Karen and his own mother and father in comparison never lost that light in their eyes. They could see something beyond their present circumstances worth striving for, whereas he stumbled and fell on a roadblock. Perspective is a horrid thing. Ichigo's hands balled into fists, one arm raising if only to block an errant spiritual arrow which nicked harmlessly off of his arrow. With perspective came the loss of ignorance. He could see from where his friends and the Shinigami were coming from in trying to aid the Soul King, but at the same time, he also knew of Nell and the Hollow's standpoints. With his goal of wishing to protect those close to him, wasn't he already doomed to fail when they were at odds? His conviction was simply not where it should have been, but at the very least dash. Ichigo worked his way through the slog of spiritual pressure, arms raised to steady Nell as she crumpled from exertion. Coyote was powerful, and with Nell only adding to that power by containing and doubling it, it wasn't without consequence. Nell had passed out a little after her attack was fired, head lolling to the side as she reverted to her base form. The fur and armor that had surrounded her in her released state faded away in motes of pink flame. Ichigo had used the time before she fell face first to intercept and catch her in his arms. The fact that he could move relatively well under the present spiritual pressure spoke of his innate talent and power. "Nell!" he called out. No response. Nell was out cold, eyes pursed shut, and breathing soft. He crouched and gently placed her on the ground. Ichigo tensed. He had to get her out of the danger zone, but before even that, he was stopped. A pair of slender legs appeared within view from narrowed and disapproving eyes. Ichigo's neck craned up, view angling past the white-styled theme the Hollows wore, and staring directly at impassive features. Tear Haribel stood before him, arms crossed, and braided hair billowing over her face. Where Coyote and Baragan had already sprung into action, she'd remained behind to observe. She wasn't impressed. "You wish to take her and run?" Haribel questioned, nearly scoffing at Ichigo's lack of an answer and indecision. "You dishonor her efforts, her sacrifice. Don't talk as if she's dead. She's not. She's breathing." Ichigo growled, incensed. "And I intend to get her somewhere safe with my family. And ruin all of her efforts by wasting the opportunity she created. What? She's not safe here," he argued. "That's an excuse and you know it." Haribel's features grew frigid, her hand pulling Ichigo up by the collar before she grimaced and deemed it not worth the effort. "Nell views you favorably, and your strength doesn't fail to reach expectation. To her, you're Pack. Do you consider her the type to pass out knowing the danger around her? You can't be that naive. You're here. Pack. She trusts you. However, your sacrifice is lacking, your resolve, feeble to not only protect her, but do what's necessary. Even now your resolve wavers. Sacrifice. It was the only word Ichigo could focus on. You have no place here. Haribel shook her head slowly, clicking her tongue knowing that she couldn't stay idle for much longer. If Ichigo couldn't understand, then what was there left to say? To begin with, she was never the most outspoken to begin with. She reconsidered a moment later when Ichigo scowled at her silence in defiance. Good. Fire was still there. Burning. Flickering. What will be the strength of your sacrifice? Haribel had doubted Nell the first time she'd introduced Ichigo to her and the rest, but the primal nature of what she could feel within his gaze spoke volumes. Then, just this once perhaps she could make an exception and indulge in her own curiosity. From her back, she drew her sword, the shing of the edge grating against its sheath echoing. To live, is to sacrifice. To choose, is to sacrifice. To protect, is to sacrifice. There is no saving everything. Golden light flickered within cerulean eyes, spiritual energy rising into a torch over Haribel's figure. A feeling swelled from within, calling out to her, resonating with her. Resurrection, segundo etapa. She spun her blade, the motion blurring into a whirl discharging massive gouts of water that enveloped her like a clam clamping over a pearl. A hunter lurks in the ocean depths, biding its time in the darkness and staring up at the light beyond. Primal instinct calls, the scent locked on. Hunter shark of water. Tiburon cazador de agua. Violently, the enveloping liquid mass dispersed in a shower of spiritual energy to reveal Haribel within. The complexion of her skin had taken on a rosier tan whilst the former blonde of her hair had shifted into waist-length white. The blue tribal markings of her released form had stretched down to her exposed chest looping beneath her breasts covered only by strips of glowing spiritual energy. Patterned gold and black markings similar to gills covered her thighs, while the rest of her was practically exposed. Over her forearms were coral-like protrusions shaped like a hollow trunk. The sword Haribel carried in her grip had become a distended trident whose pieces were formed together by virtue of a flowing yellow spiritual energy. In a deft motion, she pointed her spear's tip at Ichigo. One cannot gain without losing something in turn. She said expressionlessly, her mane of long white hair billowing in wake of her spiritual energy. To choose one option is to forego another, but it's in this process of loss that true strength hardens into the sharpest edge. The greater the sacrifice, the greater the conviction to not waste it. If a friend vouches on your behalf, you dare not ruin their credibility. If a comrade dies to give you a chance at victory, you damn well take it. Shiro's sacrifice is why I'm here, and why I fight, and I won't hesitate to end you if your choices contradict it. Haribel's tone was cold and sharp. If the price of inaction and cowardice means sacrificing everything, what would then be the sharpness of your sword? Consider it carefully, and whom you should be pointing that sword at. Saying her piece, she immediately bounded forward, uncaring for a response. An unrelenting wave of water followed Haribel's departure, drowning all those caught beneath it. Almost instantly, she joined the fray, and left Ichigo's sight. Damn it, Ichigo cursed, glancing from Nell, to his family, then back when his mother started shooting at the Quincy. What is the sharpness of your sword? The words played again, and through it all, the weight of this entire scenario once more came to mind. The Soul King's power, the Royal Guard sought to covet it while the Quincy sought to protect it. Then there were the Hollows. Their case was far simpler. Destroy it. Rot. A voice echoed throughout. A thick purple's miasma rapidly expanded, encompassing all in its way. The Quincy who touched and had their skin blacken and peel before even the bone was left rendered into dust. Nell was right that Baragan's abilities are terrifying, Ichigo swallowed. But more than that came the realization that Baragan was only testing the waters. Blacken, Ichibe intoned, a massive calligraphy brush flourished in his grip and swung. Ikimanji. Black ink swept across Baragan's miasma, coating it completely. Ikimanji was the Zanpakuto of black. Anything covered by its ink loses its true name and hence its properties and powers. Anything without a name simply becomes meaningless. An interesting ability. It's not the first I've found someone who could counter my power, yet it matters little. Baragan remarked candidly, spiritual energy growing stronger around him. I've learned that between spiritual entities such as ourselves, it all comes down to a clashing of spiritual power. Before everyone's eyes, Baragan put away his axe and drew forth a separate blade. It seemed mundane, but was regal enough to be considered a relic of a legend. It was a cross-shaped sword, gleaming in under the spotlight. A faint layer of purple miasma constantly surrounded it. Through the haze, even Ichibe, the seer of true names, could not deem anything quite so remarkable about the sword other than its make and craftsmanship. My power grants me sovereignty over time, Baragan slowly elaborated, none daring to approach him, nor stop him in the Quincy's case as he was occupying Ichibe. This would change quickly. Time ages everything. Turns it all into dust blown in the wind, but this sword, it's different. It is beyond the laws of commonality and steps into the realm of myth. A sword created by the Vasto of White, passed to me in a token gesture. Now you see, this sword and I are truly quite compatible. Crystallized legends never die, but only grow stronger with time, and time was all Baragan had in excess. He'd once vowed on his pride to never use this trinket. This pity offering, but he'd managed to overcome that shortcoming by coming to an acknowledgement of respect. He was not the God King of Hollows. What was offered to him was not a token gesture, but a gift he alone could actualize on a whim. From the very beginning, Baragan had always kept the sword offered to him by Shiro since his defeat. In all honesty, he could no longer determine how long it had aged by only that it was becoming exceedingly difficult to corrode its aura with his miasma. This was telling, and at present, he no longer saw a need to mask it. The haze surrounding the sword vanished, and a terrifying presence spread throughout, rocking the very palace with its presence and shocking all into a momentary daze. How will you deal with this? Baragan raised the sword up, a pillar shooting through the palace ceiling itself. If his rod couldn't reach the goal, then let this sword's light do the job. Ichibe, the Zero Squad, and the Quincy all suddenly shared a unanimous consensus. Stop him. // Elsewhere. He was a sword if nothing else. Nervous. The metallic tint of his tone was bereft of any emotion. Hardly. Wywak grimaced, subtly inching back a couple steps only to pause when a cage of swords descended around him. You dash. Sorry. But we're staying here. As another shockwave of spiritual energy and turbulent winds buffeted the area, many Shinigami were forced to shield their faces with their arms. Almost certainly a unanimous and depressing murmur was spreading deeply through the ranks. They're too strong. To begin with, it was said that a Vasto Lord alone could easily rival and surpass that of even the strongest captains. Now with the emergence of the Arrancar, the Quincy, and even Wywak, the Soul Society's perspective was bleak at best, and hopeless at worst. Surveying their ranks, Kisuk shook his head, dipping down the rim of his hat over his eyes. A miracle is only a miracle if even the slightest probability of victory exists, and is obtained. What we need right now, is precisely that, a miracle, he murmured, carefree features hardening. Aizen possesses the Hogyaku, the Vasto of White is an anomaly, and the blood feud of 1,000 years is coming to a pass. The predictability of events is reaching a fallacy, and the only known method to reprise that which is already lost is by a new variable. In which case, what if said variable didn't exist? Pieces exist as if on a shogi board, each with their distinct qualities and characteristics unable to be interchangeable until a requirement is reached: promotion. The answer is surely here. Stop with your rambling, Urahara. Words mean little, so iPhone sneered bitterly while nursing a wound at her side. Gauze and bandages were wrapped firmly around her waist, bruises peeking out from the cloth. We need direction. A plan. What can we do in our present states? Kisuk shut his mouth, frowning. As of the moment, nothing, Yoriyuki answered instead, brows pinched. If this place truly was Hueco Mundo, and its changes correspond to the will of the Vasto of White, then it's likely that all our movements fall within his perception. Nothing is worse in combat than running blind under the eyes of a predator. Kisuk, there is much to consider before taking impulsive action. This gamble has much to lose. And everything to lose if this plays out in any side's favor. Kisuk grunted. The Quincy seek to destroy the world order, and the Vasto of White is not how you all perceive him, a cutting tone interjected in the growing dissonance. Haplessly, Kisuk and the other Shinigami glanced towards the Zanpakuto spirit wreathed in regal blue armor, carrying a sheath and sword in her hands. At first, they may have considered the wayward spirit an enemy, but all the same, they couldn't. It may have been a form of chivalry, but the spirit actively shielded them from the spiritual energies prevalent across the battlefield through a particular golden glow of her sheath. Moreover, the feeling of warmth and light exuding from her could in no way be attributed to vile or evil. Instead, it was wholesome, bright, and charismatic. The spirit in no way thought it prudent to allow any injured to be caught up in the crossfire of a conflict beyond their capability. The magnanimity and graciousness of her acts and demeanor wasn't lost on anyone. This made it all the more difficult to accept her stance to bicker and argue with her. It was a losing battle, her resolve unshakable. Kisuk was smart enough not to argue the point and shift to another. It wouldn't do to return a favor with antagonism. Vasto of White aside, beautiful spirit, but can you say the same for Aizen? It was kind of cute the way the spirit's features crinkled indecisively. He's a complicated man. I'm not hearing a yes, now, am I? Rather complicated is akin to distrustful. A wise decision if anything. I'm glad we all agree and are of the same accord. Did I say that? Did you just put words in my mouth? The spirit looked to Kisuk, then to everyone else who couldn't meet her eyes. It was like the spirit was dealing with sharp-tongued aristocracy all over again, and she detested them to begin with. No, the more apt description was that she'd always been weaker in the way of the tongue than the sword. This was the wizard staff's job wherever that womanizing staff spurt was. No wonder Kyuka hates you, the spirit muttered under her breath. Kisuk tilted his head at the words, before realization set in, and he didn't bother to interject. It was probably true anyway. By Kyuka there could only be one Zanpakuto spirit Kisuk was familiar with. But wait, if this spirit knew of Kyuka, did it not stand to reason that it would know others as well? Oh, do you happen to know my Benihime? Kisuk proposed out of curiosity. That sadistic woman is yours. The spirit assessed Kisuk up and down in bewilderment. How deceiving looks can be, the spirit grimaced almost immediately, scratching the back of her head as if recollecting. Recently she's taken a liking to bickering with the Hound of the Red Plains and the cursed Red Spear. Certainly, sounds like her, Kisuk mused, fingers rubbing over his scraggly beard. Oh, then do you know Katen Kyakotsu? Shunsui interjected from the side with an air of levity, despite the situation. Everyone else within earshot was just as curious but didn't let it show due to the silent Yamamoto, and the aggravation around So iPhone. The spirit furrowed her brows in thought. The children's game addicts who scare the little priest twins. They're not that bad, are they? Shunsui winced at the description, knowing full well whom was being referred. They turn honorable spars into games. The flat look over the spirit's expression said it all, but this wasn't the point. So iPhone snapped and crossed her arms in aggravation, shooting everyone a withering stare to stay silent before leering dubiously at Kisuk. Kisuk, get onto it. She snarled. Get to the point. We have no time to be wasting here. You had a plan, or are empty words all you've got? I wouldn't say empty words, but there is something I'm thinking of, but I would require the aid of you all and the ability to keep close to me. And how do you expect us to do that like this? So iPhone gestured to herself, the injured captains, and the demoralized Shinigami. With a little help, Kisuk drew his sword, red swaths of spiritual energy exuding over its entire length. It had been a long time since he'd taken an active approach to his methods, but there was little choice to be had in this matter. Kisuk glanced at Kenpeki and the other injured patched up to the best of Anohana's ability before shutting his eyes and calling to his sword. Twisting his wrist, he flourished it, before letting it fall. From the tip up, blood curdled into a pool in which the hands of a giant woman clawed out for purchase. Braided hair tied in loops over her head appeared next, skin laden with the distinct grooves and joints of a mannequin or puppet. Modification of the Crimson Princess dissection at the doors of Avalakai Tesvara. Benkai, Kisuk whispered, Benihim's fingers caressing his cheek. Kanan Bairiki Benihim Aratum. The spirit bristled at the sight of Benihim, but said nothing despite already having an idea of Benihim's capabilities. Of course, Kisuk took notice. Will you be stopping us, Aju-san? He asked. No. The spirit shook her head before letting out a breath and coming to a decision. You are allowed to do as you wish, and who am I to stop you? But, perhaps you would welcome me along. Kisuk and the others blinked at the sudden proposal. You actually wish to join? Yuruaki hopped up onto her feet and strided over, assessing the spirit with a critical eye. Aren't you tied with the Vasto of White? Kisuk hummed, neither in agreement or rejection. The inexplicit jab of suspicion was evident to anyone's ears, but the spirit remained unperturbed. Would you say the same for Benihime? The spirit countered without pause, causing Kisuk to stiffen before she then turned to address everyone else as a whole. Motes of light surrounded her in a luminescent radiance, highlighting the bright wheat color of her hair. Would all of you say the same for your respective Zanpakuto? Would you doubt them, and their devotion? She queried, causing a wave of unrest and denials. The spirit continued regardless. They're all here, in this place, this medium, this precipice of the soul. You need only call, and they will surely answer. The spirit's words were not without meaning. If the loyalty of the Zanpakuto spirits was under question before, the spoken words were practically a blatant answer. Free will, Kisuk murmured in conclusion, his brows furrowing. If this was truly the case, then the fact that they would aid the Vasto of White gave some credibility to the spirit's words regarding the Lord of Hollows. However, like it or not, the Vasto of White's existence was one that jeopardized all order of the system in place. There was no room for hesitation. Kisuk opened his mouth, but was then interrupted before he could even get a word out. Why do you fight? Yamamoto spoke up for the first time. His injuries impaired him, but the aura of his person was left intact. Perhaps, the most heavily impacted with transpired events was none other than him. The spirit regarded Yamamoto with an air of melancholy. Laws, duty, and honor may not always uphold the correct outcome in mind, but rather a preferred one. Yamamoto didn't react other than a twitch of his brow. Everyone has their reasons, as you all surely do, but the answer is here beyond logic and doubt. The spirit placed her hands over her chest. Follow your heart. Right or wrong, no one can truly be arbitrator and judge but one's self. I'd fight with you as I am, not because I agree with you, but because I wish to ease his burden in what little way I can. That's an open declaration of hostility, if anything. So iPhone pointed out. Indeed, the spirit didn't deny this. But aren't we all the same? Or do you not harbor some ulterior motive after dealing with the Quincy? It's a tad hypocritical that you'd use his forces for your gains, but then are defensive in my participation with yours. Your wielder must have been a ruler of sorts, Shunsui sighed in response, smiling softly. You're too frank and straightforward. The aura around you even reminds me of the old man. The spirit didn't respond, but merely nodded instead. How strong are you? Yes. That's not dash. We'll let you come along. Yuruaki interrupted, her sixth sense aiding in her decision and overruling Kisuk's caution and logic. You don't seem the type to attack from the back. The spirit appeared offended at the remark. I am no cowardly assassin. Well, there you have it. Yuruaki smacked Kisuk in the back before regarding everyone else. Come on, let's get down to it. Kisuk and the rest grunted. Eyeing the spiritual fluctuations within the Soul King's palace, Kisuk raised an arm. Wait for my signal. This battle was surely reaching its conclusion, the players each possessing their own motives, but only one side would be victorious. The cards were already set and revealed. Mind calculating several thoughts a second, Kisuk eventually settled on dealing with what he got. He glanced at the spirit, then at all the other Zanpakuto spirits fighting Waiwak. He then compared it all to the Siriti's remaining forces, and inwardly grumbled. With their odds, help was better than nothing, even if it came with strings attached. The ends justify the means. Suddenly, a towering light beyond that of what ordinary souls should have been capable of harnessing pierced through the palace's walls. A glimmer flickered over Kisuk's eyes. The time had come. Sing, Benihime. Chapter 70. Power unimaginable coalesced all around Baragan in an unending tide of spiritual energy that stunned all. Even Coyote was taken aback, let alone Kisuk and the others who were making their way to the Soul King's palace from the outside. The sheer magnitude of the energy's presence was impossible to not notice. This went doubly for Waiwak, who was frowning heavily from afar. "Stop him!" The panic in Ichibei's shout spoke volumes, the fact that he'd worked together with Quincy in a desperate moment, even more so. However, desperation did not give way to opportunity. Just because one wishes and yearns for their desired outcome, doesn't mean that the world would bend and shift to accommodate. The sanctimonious aura exuding from the sword in Baragan's hands was absolute. It was unreasonable, unbearably so with its output. Even Shiro alone couldn't amass so much spiritual pressure with just a single weapon, but in Baragan's hands, any sort of noble phantasm was beyond simply destructive. It was maddening. Ichibei, as the man said to have named all things, was left baffled, panicked even, for a single reason. The sword before him, he did not know its name. It was only now that the situation was so dire and pressing that further realization dawned upon Ichibei. One glance with his spiritual senses all but verified that many of the Zanpakuto spirits fighting in this world were also unknown to him. This should have been impossible, as he was the one to name each of them. These Zanpakuto spirits, and the very sword in Baragan's hands, as far as Ichibei was concerned, shouldn't have existed. It was impossible, and yet the power and presence emanating from around him was a jarring reality. A keening clang of metal reverberated throughout, the light surrounding the sword in Baragan's grasp blinding even him with its radiance alone. Who would dare meet its attack? Stop him! Ichibei, the royal guard, and the Quincy took one good look at the energy before them, and felt their souls shiver. Was it even possible? There was no such thing as a charge time for Baragan. How long had his time acceleration already been in contact with this particular sword for? How many years had passed for that sword? How many eons surrounding in accelerated time? The seed of a crystallized legend had long since become the foundation of a mighty oak. The sword in Baragan's hands was like none other. Without care, and in a despairingly nonchalant manner, the sword was swung without any preemptive fanfare. All the energy stored within it was released at once, defying the very logic of the dimension in its capacity to topple anything in its way. A white line in the shape of a half-crescent descended. There were no special properties around it, nor unseen effects. Instead, it was simply the rapid accumulation of spiritual energy so compactly condensed that it distorted the air in its path. It was pure spiritual energy at its finest, spanning towards the horizon in its descent. The only force that dared to meet it beyond the barrage of spiritual arrows, swords, and constructs, was a tide of blank ink. Ichibei swung his long calligraphy brush in rapid motion, each stroke creating ink markings that sought to paint over the white crescent to no avail. It was a clash between white and black, but the darkness of the ink could do little to fade the radiance of the white. Fueled by Baragan's decay, the power swelling from the noble phantasm was never-ending, its strength born from legend fostered through time immemorial. The level of destructive power was unreal despite even Ichibei's efforts to reduce the strike's lethality. His was a power that could call true names and wipe the very definition of things from existence. If one took away the WA characters from water, all that would be left was something with hardly any meaning nor significance. This would reflect on the object named as well. In this case, Ichibei practically reduced attack into nothing more than K, and yet, the division of a practically infinite source was still infinity. The crescent strike continued on unabated. Move. Don't try to block it with your body. Ichibei called in warning when he saw Senjumaru dare attempt to block the strike through weaving several layers of cloth in front of her. Startled at the sudden cry, Senjumaru paused mid-action and stepped aside. Nonetheless, several lines of fabric had already been erected. This barrier created from high-density defensive properties of Senjumaru's cloth could likely even stop Waiwaka's attacks for a brief moment to buy time for more countermeasures. In some part of Ichibei, the expectation that it could hold out after he'd practically erased over 90% of the strike's power was still there. Alas, the strike tore through everything like paper to reach its goal. Barriers, Kido, spiritual constructs, nothing was stopping as it neared and struck in half the crystal housing the Soul King and continued thereafter. It hit the floor, the walls, and even the foundation of the palace, yet cut through everything before dissipating. The entire palace was rent asunder, bisected from the middle down and falling apart. Pieces of rubble fell, the plaza hoisting the central palace, snapping in half with pieces of debris and shattered chain links raining down. The fighting outside ground to a halt, numerous Zanpakuto spirits, Shinigami, and Waiwaka's shadowed figures watching in muted disbelief. "Humph. The task is done," Baragan declared imperiously from up high. The sword in his hand no longer shone with the same luster, but had instead dimmed considerably. The longer he held it though, the more discernible it was that it was already beginning the process of recharging. Ichibe paled as many others did at the outcome of this all. "Do you not realize what you've done?" he finally snapped, any semblance of composure replaced by inexhaustible frustration. "You've doomed this world, wrought apart the balance, and condemned us all. And that's where you're wrong," Baragan leered from up high. Smoke and clouds of dust obscured visibility around the entire area, but it couldn't mask the red spiritual energy stirring within Baragan's hollow eye sockets. "Your king dies, the Quincy Emperor will follow this path soon, and all that remain will be the hollows." "You're insane," Ichibe forced out through gritted teeth. "Once this world's balance collapses, there's no guarantee in our survival including yourself." "Wrong again," Baragan pointed out. "Crumbling world. Balance? What does that all mean in the face of our Lord of Hollows?" "The Vasto of White," Hikaifian mumbled the title out from near Ichibe, but it was as lightning struck his mind. "Hueco Mundo." Ichibe's eyes once more took in the world around him. Baragan's only reply was laughter, long and drawn out. "Indeed. So, what if the world collapses? With the Vasto of White around and no Waiwak or Soul King on his level to oppose him, what was to stop the Vasto of White from creating another Hueco Mundo for the Hollows? Nothing. The Vasto of White would be the sole power, and rule upon a new balance, a new world order, where Baragan imagined Hollows would reign supreme among the lesser beings. "Evil creature," Ichibe gnashed his teeth. "Evil? Truly you Shinigami know how to compliment," Baragan chortled. "But I suppose it's only natural to acknowledge your betters. This king had once been humbled too, but now I see beyond it all. It was fate. Destiny. You see this sword?" Baragan flaunted the blade in his palms. "It's not the only one of its kind. Any sword in this world may be the same, but I alone am the only one who can power them to such an extent. Do you see? Do you understand?" Haribel and the other hollows nearby couldn't help but realize the point Baragan was making and grew intrigued. The way Baragan was speaking, it was as if Shiro had some use for him from the very beginning. In the past, the Vasto of White remained alone and unnoticed upon a single hill, while all along I had ruled in the very world he created and deemed myself a king, a god. Baragan explained, relishing in a foreign feeling of accomplishment. What was there to care for? The task was done by his hands. Truly he possessed the most merit. I was the king in the open, while he was the power supporting us from the back all along with no ambition. Then what does it mean for my power that so complements the Vasto of Whites? What can it not mean other than the role granted upon me? Surely, I am the king's right hand. Enforcer. Lawmaker. Judge of the New World Order. Ichibe's countenance darkened with each and every word he heard. Meanwhile, Haribel, who arguably knew Baragan's policies the longest before meeting Shiro, grudgingly chose not to disapprove Baragan's assumptions. As an enemy, he was terrifying, but she could ask for no better ally that could aid Shiro when necessary. "This can't be." Hikaifian mumbled from the side, and Senjumaru and the rest of the royal guard tried to peer through the smoke of where the Soul King's crystal was cut apart. They were desperate, hoping that even if the vessel was damaged, that it could retain the power necessary to change the tides of this war. Ichibe wasn't quite as optimistic as his colleagues, having attempted to stop the Crescent attack, but he too looked in the direction of the Soul King's crystal. The Quincy held their breaths, Haribel, Coyote, and the hollows who could now see within the bisected palace did the same. As the dust cleared, and the smoke wafting from falling debris blew away, light glinted in Ichibe's eyes while confusion marred everyone else's. A hand. The question voiced everyone's thoughts. There, forcibly clasping the two halves of the Soul King's crystal together, was a large hand pail anchored by tethered bands of spiritual energy leading to one unexpected place. Kisuke and the captains and wizard he was leading to the now destroyed Soul King's palace faltered momentarily when everyone had turned to look towards them. Well, not them in particular, but one person in their group who coughed out blood and slumped, falling right out of the air only to be caught by Anohana. Shunsui's eyes widening in concerned alarm, staring at the base of a shadowed forearm sprouting from his best friend's chest. Yuka-take. What did you do? The only reply Jushiro could muster was a shake of his head, as if it had to be done. Mimi Heiji, Ichibe whispered with renewed vigor, yet it was clear enough for Shunsui to hear. Already, Shunsui's patience for the Zero Squad had grown thin, and now that it seemed that another one of their schemes now involved his best friend, his features grew apocalyptic. His hands near instantly drew his swords and moved to cut the limb sprouting over Jushiro's chest, but was stopped by several swirls of cloth binding him. This is the only way, Senjumaru's taciturn voice pierced deeply into Shunsui's psyche, his eyes growing frigid. He's dying. Shunsui struggled against the restraints, eyeing those around him to help, but they hesitated, and lost the deciding the factor. The arm fully left Jushiro, moving to his chest to his mouth where it left only a shriveled husk, gasping for breath and failing to even take in air. Captain, Anohana, Shunsui swallowed audibly, hoping against all hope. Anohana shook her head with Jushiro still cradled within the glow of her hands. He has no lungs, and the spiritual energy in his body has been pilfered by the arm, she explained solemnly. She could not heal this level of injury with her current means, and neither could the human girl with remarkable healing prowess. Orium's healing may be able to reverse the time on a person to a point where they were in optimum condition, but Yuka-take's case was different. He'd never been in an optimum state, so there was nothing to revert to. He's dying. Shunsui slumped in desperation as the cloth binding him loosened and set him free. For what it's worth, his sacrifice will be remembered. Enough, Shunsui's tone was cold, cutting Senjumaru's condolence off. If you'd just done your jobs properly. Senjumaru sighed, but held nothing against the outburst before retracting her spiritual senses controlling her cloth. Shunsui looked to Jushiro whom he'd been friends with since their academy days, and balled his hands into fists. None of this felt worth it. Yamaji, these people can't be who we work for, he spoke with grievance, and at this, Yamamoto had no reply. The old man just kept staring at one of his students' final moments, and silently shut his eyes. There was nothing that could be done. Spirits bless us each to our guided utopias. Lady Spirit, Shunsui's expression flickered towards the lady spirit carrying a sword and sheath who approached Anohana. There was a type of aura around the spirit that was nourishing in its tranquility. Many had been unsure if letting the lady spirit accompany them was a good call on Kisuk's part, but now Shunsui firmly felt that it was justified. Beyond the outer layers exists a land of plenty, of flowing grass, and soft winds, where the warrior lays to rest, the spirit whispered. The lady spirit glanced at Jushiro's dying breaths, and under everyone's eyes, placed the sheath she was carrying over top of him. A garden in bloom watched over by a being of flowers where no sinners may leave. The sheath flickered before sinking into Jushiro's chest. A golden light bloomed, pulsating over Jushiro's skin and improving the pallor of his complexion. His gasping breath eased, the pain over his features smoothing over. An ever-distant utopia, the lady spirit invoked. Anohana, who was still holding Jushiro, widened her eyes after diagnostic. His lungs, she trailed off. They're regrowing. She mumbled. Not only that, the rapid regeneration of his body was practically reflected under Anohana's scrutiny. He'll be fine, she concluded for all to hear. All of a sudden, the way everyone regarded the lady spirit shifted noticeably, none more so than Shunsui and a silent Yamamoto. "Hello you one, pretty lady," Shunsui inclined his head, the brim of his straw hat pushing down over his features, trying to hide the tears of relief. The lady spirit snorted with a kind mirth, noting Shunsui's actions for what they were, but not calling him out. She returned to the topic of conversation instead. "You best not be too serious," she jested while growing more solemn. "I do take oaths and promises as sacred, and I may indeed hold you to your words," she warned. Come what may then, Shunsui couldn't hide the relief in his tone. He didn't want to lose any more people he cherished, and then an angel came and saved his best friend's life. For a Zanpakuto spirit, you're obviously not the vile sort. If I may even be presumptuous, I'd even consider you the honorable type, which speaks volumes for your wielder. Ah, you get it then. My wielder is a man who just doesn't want to see anyone cry. She nodded at Shunsui and smiled serenely at him, this time far more genuine. Then I'll hold you to your words. Shunsui tipped his head again. A man who doesn't want to see anyone cry, huh? He could respect that. Perhaps only that kind of man could produce such a Zanpakuto as the Lady Spirit. All Zanpakuto were created from half of the wielder's soul. In a way, a Zanpakuto offers a window into who the wielder was. Take Shunsui's own swords. Their childish nature found in children's games belied a hidden lethality in the morose setting of his Bankai. Soft at heart, yet fiercely violent when provoked. In this case, the Lady Spirit that had shown up to the aid of their injured comrades out of a sense of righteousness was trustworthy in Shunsui's books. The measure of a good man is he who knows the right thing and accomplishes it, but a better measure is the number of people kept alive or saved along the way. The Lady Spirit's noble light and earnest compassion weren't fake. Anyone could see it. This was a soul brighter than most and unfettered by doubts. Your wielder must be something special, Shunsui couldn't help but compliment. On that we can agree. The Lady Spirit nodded her head, and said no more before moving away from Yukatake. Her sheath was no longer with her, but she still had her sword in hand. What an admirable spirit! Shunsui's eyes and those of Kisuk and the rest, subtly surveyed their fellow Shinigami evacuated from the Soul Society. They were searching, seeking to make a new acquaintance, not only due to the Lady Spirit's character, but due to the significance of her potent healing properties. It was practically regrowing Jushiro's lungs. Could it regrow lost limbs and other such wounds too? Moreover, the wielder of such a Zanpakuto was surely a kind person. Which Shinigami is it? Shunsui mused to himself. One of the Shinigami evacuated from the Soul Society had to be this Lady Spirit's wielder. The fact that Shunsui couldn't recognize the Lady Spirit by the sword and sheath likely meant that she could belong to a relatively new Shinigami without access to their Shikai or Bankai. An academy student then? Ahem, Kisuk broke the moment, reminding them of the direness of the situation despite feeling the most intrigued, but he shook his head wryly. Right then, let's continue, he said before leading the way with only a single thought in his mind. If the sheath's healing properties were that potent, then what was the use of the sword? How infuriating! Baragan narrowed his eyes upon the hand negating the damage of his efforts, and grimaced. It almost made no sense to him. No, it was in fact rather infuriating. His victory felt as if it were snatched from right before him, and worse, he glanced at the noble phantasm Shiro had given him. Its glow was no longer the same as before, which meant to say, its power output was now much lower. He sneered, but watched as Ichibe, the Quincy, and the members of the Royal Guard scrambled to form some sort of defensive line around the crystal enshrouding the Soul King's body. Were they truly that naive? Without warning, purple miasma traveled down Baragan's right arm and pooled into the sword in his hand. Instantly, the degree of brightness heightened several folds as his power acted upon it. Respira, he whispered while raising the sword up high. The attack would no longer be as powerful, but each swing would still garner a substantial force. More so if he charged it in the way he was doing now. He'd only need a few minutes at most to swing down once again, and even the strike was weaker than before, so too were the defenses. Your feeble resistance matters little, Baragan mused aloud. Judging from the distance, and his own capabilities, Baragan gauged that there was no one that would be able to interrupt him until he was proven wrong. Clang! A spiritual bullet clashed against the metal of the sword with such force that it snapped out of Baragan's grip. Narrowing his eyes, Baragan used Sonito to catch the sword, but several more bullets appeared within his periphery and struck at his outstretched arm. The impact of the bullets with his arrow created muted bangs that annoyed Baragan more than anything else. Worse, the noble phantasm Shiro had given him had plummeted to the ground far below and disappeared behind a curtain of Yahwaka's specters. Glancing at his arms, holes were formed through the bones, the jeweled bangles over his wrists appearing mottled and empty. It pierced his arrow. He couldn't block it. Insolent vermin, Baragan's features darkened further and further when he turned his sights on a Quincy wielding what looked to be a bulky sniper rifle. Immediately, several more rounds were fired, forcing Baragan to maneuver around them until Coyote intervened, firing back at the man's location only to frown. It went through, Coyote muttered before maneuvering to dodge retaliatory fire. Subsequently, she made eye contact with Baragan. "I'll handle him," she said flatly before using Sonido to instantly appear near the shooter and engaging. Thereafter, a column of water burst up beside Baragan to reveal Haribal with Sharkfin sword now turned into a spear. "The Shinigami have arrived," she informed simply, gesturing with a tilt of chin. Baragan glanced down to see Kisuk and the other Shinigami engage the Quincy. Each captain seemed to zoom in on specific Sternritter accompanied by what looked like their respective Zanpakuto spirits. Then again, with Baragan cleaving the Soul King's palace asunder, the battlefield had stretched beyond the inner platform and encompassed the whole area. The Zanpakuto spirits, hollows, and Waiwaka's specters were now getting mixed into the fray. "I won't be needing your aid," was all Baragan said to Haribal after she'd spoken. "Never intended on giving it," Haribal replied tonelessly. "As quick to deride me as usual. Your courage is what entertained me while I sent others to hunt you down," Baragan reminisced, uncaring for the scornful glower Haribal sent his way. "I'll be the one to see this through," Haribal clicked her tongue, and rushed down with a tsunami of water behind her. Baragan snorted, but he too began moving straight towards Ichibe and the royal guard who were practically at their wits' end. Sure, the Soul King's body was stabilized by the emergence of an arm to grasp it together, but there was one aspect Ichibe and the rest could never account for. What could the five of them alone do against an army of Quincy and Hollows? Even if they were strong individually, they still had to somehow break through the Quincy trying to protect the Soul King's body, while repelling the advances of Baragan and the rest. No matter how they thought about it, the task before them was too monumental to achieve even for them. This was why there was only a single method left in Ichibe's mind. "Cover me," he signaled to Hakaifun and the rest before making a beeline straight towards the Soul King's body. All manner of attacks and barriers were erected in order to stop his advance, but his large calligraphy brush painted over them all with ink. The dark liquid splattered and smeared, wiping away all meaning and reducing them to nothing. With a gentle weaving stroke, the path ahead was clear, the strength of attacks mitigated to nothing. Many Quincy instantly stood in his way, one of which grinned at the prospect of a miracle that had no chance of happening as Ichibe merely bypassed them all. Swiping his brush beneath the platform just barely suspended by interlinked chains, Ichibe wiped away the tangibility aspect of the floor, momentarily staggering those before him such that he zipped past them as they created spiritual discs to stand over. Following Ichibe were several bands of cloth, and the rest of the royal guard filling in the gaps to buy even just a few minutes of time. All at once, Ichibe reached the Soul King's body radiating with a power beyond any ordinary soul. "It's over," Ichibe declared solemnly. He'd never wanted to use this approach as it guaranteed the loss of the Soul King's vessel, but at this point with the body already bisected, it was a moot consideration. They were just going to have to need a replacement afterwards, yet it wasn't as if it was impossible. The availability of a new vessel already existed, and all that was required now was the strength to subdue it. Rather than allow Waiwak to fully assimilate the power to dictate the world's balance, Ichibe would rather use it for a more productive means. First to subdue the uprising of the Quincy, and second to stamp out the lofty ambitions of the Hollows, then recreate the natural world order. All that he needed to do was bypass the crystal-like defense around the Soul King's body, and using the natural affinity he had as a being with the Soul King's flesh, he'd assimilate the power. From there, he could momentarily step into an existence on the same level as Waiwak and the Vasto of White. No one would be able to contend with him with the other two heavy hitters preoccupied. Better yet, with the other two competitors at each other's throats, he may be able to exploit their weaknesses in their exhaustion. Yes. This was doable. No. It was better to say it was the only chance Ichibe thought the royal guard had. Words couldn't describe how hopeless he'd felt when he saw the Soul King's body cut apart earlier. Yet through the very hand of fate, a second chance was given through the Soul King's own arm known as Mimiheiji. The plan was simple, easy even after disregarding the safety of the Soul King's vessel, and yet at the critical moment when Ichibe thrust his hands forward into the lattice crystal binding, he found that he'd missed the intended target by mere millimeters. It was to the point where he'd only managed to touch the Soul King's clothes rather than stab his arms into the man. The Soul King remained untouched within the crystal, leaving only holes where Ichibe had pierced his arms through. The entire battlefield seemed to shatter into fragments of glass at this moment, all color draining from the scenery like some sick joke. "Sorry," the devil's voice whispered. A man stepped out into reality beside the Soul King's crystal as if he'd always been there, sword plunged through Ichibei's heart and wrenching the man away. Beside the man, a regal woman stepped out, tranquil eyes staring at the faces of all. Kisuk and the wizard narrowed their gazes. "I was honestly content to sit back and study this further dash." The man shook his head in dismay while gingerly pulling out his sword without giving any time for retaliation. The woman beside him then used a burst of spiritual energy to fling Ichibei away. "But someone dared try to touch something that's mine." With bloodshot eyes, Ichibei glanced up at the man before him, recognition born from description registering in his mind. Aizen Saoshik. Usurper, traitor. Ichibei forced out through clenched teeth. Remarkably, he was still alive despite his heart being skewered. "Now then, just now, you were trying to siphon the lingering power of the Soul King, were you not?" Aizen grinned contemptuously. "Though I do suppose I should thank you for not only demonstrating the means to do so, but breaking through this troublesome defensive crystal. I admit, I was lacking the durability of a natural oaken, but the bodies of the royal guards are blessed with the ability to do so." Noting how short on time he was, Aizen still took things at leisure, knowing that Kyuka Suijutsu's hypnosis was still in effect for the large majority of all those fighting. Ichibei however was no pushover. This urged Aizen to continue with unconcealed excitement. This was it, the first and final step to reaching his long-desired goal. It was the worst possible development for Ichibei. No. Ichibei knew what was coming and tried desperately to accelerate forward, but the main problem wasn't his injuries, but that he was too far away to even try to intervene in time. Without fanfare, Aizen resolutely turned all of his attention onto the Soul King's body. "It's time you welcome your new king," he murmured to Ichibei in passing. Aizen then directly plunged his arm into the Soul King using the holes Ichibei himself had jabbed through. The Hogyaka within Aizen's Shiakusho shone brightly, but more than anything, his eyes gradually turning blue and his spiritual energy skyrocketing signaled his ascension to the next level. Finally, after all these years of careful planning and considerations, I am the world. Check the description for the links to the author.